We often hear that humans are the most intelligent species, that we dominate the Earth, build cities, and reshape the entire planet. But the real story begins very differently. There was no civilization, no language, no technology. There were only ape-like creatures living in Africa, facing a world that was changing faster than their ability to adapt. Around 6 to 7 million years ago, the lineage that would eventually lead to humans began to separate from the common ancestor shared with chimpanzees and gorillas. At that time, there were no humans. There was no evolution as we understand it today. Nothing grand happened then. There was no invention, no moment of enlightenment. There was only a changing world. And as forests slowly retreated, a few individuals began to stand for longer periods, not because they understood what was coming, not because they intended to become a different species. They simply discovered that when they stood up, the horizon opened a little wider. They could see danger approaching from farther away. They could travel farther across the burning ground. And their hands, for the first time, were no longer used only to cling, but to carry what was needed to survive another day. None of them knew that those brief moments of standing upright were quietly pulling an entire lineage onto a different path. Millions of years later, those creatures gradually learned to walk on two legs. We call them early hominins, Australopithecus. They did not have large brains. They did not know how to make complex tools. And they still had to climb trees to survive. But from that moment on, the human way of moving had diverged onto a different road. Then around 2 million years ago, a new species appeared, Homo habilis, the handyman. They were not stronger, they were not faster, but they could do something new. They knew how to strike stone to make tools. Those crude stone flakes were not used to build, not used to create art. They were used to cut meat, to break bones, and to extract more energy for a brain that was slowly growing larger. From that point forward, every step in human evolution was tied to physical change. A more upright posture, more flexible hands, a steadily enlarging brain, increasingly complex tools. But the most important thing to remember is this: there was not always only one human species. For most of evolutionary history, Earth was home to multiple human species at the same time. Some were stronger than us. Some tolerated cold better. Some survived for hundreds of thousands of years. And then all of them disappeared. Around 300,000 years ago, Homo sapiens, the wise human, appeared. We were not the first to walk upright, not the first to use tools, and not the only human species to ever live on Earth. We are simply the ones who survived until today. In this video, we will journey through 5 to 6 million years of human evolution, not to glorify it, not to celebrate it, but to understand one very basic truth. Modern humans were shaped by extremely small changes unfolding across millions of years. Every posture, every tool, every step of adaptation to the environment. And if just a few of those steps had not happened, you and I likely would not be here. If you are ready, let us begin at the starting point. 6 to 7 million years ago, when humans were not yet human, and this story had only just begun. About 6 to 7 million years ago, the Earth had no awareness that it was preparing for the emergence of human beings. There were no warning signs, no sudden events. What was unfolding at that time moved too slowly for any living creature to recognize that it was existing in the midst of a long turning point in the history of life. Africa, where this story begins, was not the dry, cracked, desolate land often imagined in modern depictions. It was a vast and diverse continent undergoing a quiet yet profound transformation. The climate did not change over a single season or a single generation. It shifted gradually across hundreds of thousands, then millions of years. Temperatures fluctuated. Rainfall patterns became irregular. Familiar cycles began to lose their former stability. For millions of years before this, dense tropical forests had stretched across much of the region. It was a dark green world where sunlight was filtered through multiple layers of leaves before reaching the ground. Most living space existed above the surface among interwoven tree trunks, where branch connected to branch, forming a natural network that allowed primates to move through the canopy. Primates at that time were fully adapted to this environment. Their bodies were designed for life in the trees, flexible shoulders for climbing hands and feet, capable of gripping tightly opposable thumbs that allowed them to grasp branches securely. Their diet reflected this arboreal life as well. Seasonally ripening fruit, young leaves shoot soft roots along with insects and small bird eggs provided their primary sources of energy. All survival activities were tied to the rhythm of the forest. Life unfolded mostly above the ground, where it was safer from terrestrial predators. Sleeping in trees, moving through the canopy, foraging within the limits allowed by reach and agility. In that world, quadrupedal movement was not merely an option, it was the optimal solution. It offered stability, speed, and rapid response to danger. For a long time, the ground itself was not an ideal place for survival. It was open, exposed, and filled with unpredictable threats. Only when necessary did primates descend, and usually for short periods. Returning to the trees remained the priority. But as the climate slowly changed, this picture began to develop gaps. Forests did not disappear entirely, but they were no longer continuous. Open patches emerged between wooded areas, forcing tree-dwelling species to confront a new reality, to reach food sources, to move between familiar areas. They could no longer rely solely on branches and leaves. This was not a catastrophe, but a prolonged adjustment. An environment no longer perfectly aligned with what bodies had evolved to expect. And it was precisely within this small misalignment between biology and environment that the earliest changes in the human lineage began to take shape. Not through awareness, not through deliberate choice, but through very natural responses to a world that was slowly becoming different. Climate did not remain still. Long-term planetary shifts made wet and dry seasons increasingly unpredictable. Average temperatures changed. Forests began to contract, not vanishing suddenly, but thinning patch by patch. Between wooded areas appeared open land, where direct sunlight reached the ground, creating low grasses and early forms of savanna. This transformation did not immediately destroy the old ecosystem, but it made life harder to predict. Food was no longer evenly distributed. Distances between resources increased. Creatures accustomed to moving continuously through tree canopies were now forced to face a new reality. The ground was becoming an increasingly important part of their survival. Within this context existed a particular primate lineage. Not because it stood out, not because it was superior to others. At that time, even if one could observe from an external vantage point, it would have been nearly impossible to identify which group would eventually lead to humans, and which would diverge along other evolutionary paths. All appeared similar, occupied similar spaces, and faced challenges that differed only slightly. This lineage would eventually lead to modern humans. But 6 to 7 million years ago, that outcome was not defined. The split from the common ancestor shared with chimpanzees and gorillas did not occur as a clear moment, nor as an observable event. It did not resemble a door closing or a boundary drawn on an evolutionary map. The divergence was more like two dirt paths initially overlapping. For a long stretch, they ran in the same direction under similar environmental conditions. Only after sufficient time had passed did it become clear that they had drifted apart. There was no abrupt turning point, only small differences accumulating across thousands, then millions of generations. At that time, concepts such as human or hominin did not exist as we define them today. These labels are products of modern science, applied after everything had already happened. The reality then consisted only of different primate populations scattered across slightly different environments, ranging from dense forests to transitional zones between forest and open land. Each population faced its own survival pressures. Some lived where trees remained dense, where climbing skills were paramount. Others frequently crossed open areas where visibility and early detection of danger became more valuable. These environmental differences, though subtle, were sufficient to drive different adjustments in how bodies functioned. Over time, these differences accumulated into physical change. Bones bore weight in slightly different ways. Muscles were used differently. Gait posture and weight distribution began to shift very slowly. This was not a purposeful transformation, but the natural result of bodies responding to the environments in which they had to survive. One point must be emphasized: the separation from the common ancestor did not occur because of intelligence. Members of this lineage were not significantly more intelligent than other primates of the same period. Their brains were not larger. There is no evidence of language, no manufactured tools, no long-term planning, no awareness of the future or of the self in the modern human sense. They did not think about tomorrow. They did not imagine future generations. Each day consisted of immediate reactions to their surroundings, seeking food when hungry, avoiding danger, when threatened, finding shelter when night fell. Life unfolded within a narrow temporal window, tightly bound to the present. If anything distinguished this lineage, it was not cognitive ability, but a very slight flexibility in how the body was used. At the time, these changes held no special meaning. They did not make individuals superior or remarkable. But in a gradually changing environment, these small differences produced a better fit to specific conditions. Looking back from the present, we call this process divergence. But for the creatures living through it, no separation occurred. There were only paths slowly drifting apart until one day they no longer crossed again. That is how the lineage leading to humans began. Not through intelligence, not through awareness, but through small differences accumulating quietly over time. The earliest differences lay in something far more modest: how bodies were used to move through a changing space. As forests thinned and distances between food sources increased, moving entirely on four limbs across the ground became less efficient. Visibility was limited. A low posture made early detection of predators more difficult. Continuous crouching also consumed more energy over long distances. Under these conditions, some individuals began to stand upright more frequently. Not fully upright, and certainly not like modern humans. These were brief moments, standing just long enough to look around, to cross open ground, to reduce time spent close to the surface. When the body rose off the ground, surrounding space changed in a specific way. The horizon, previously blocked by tall grass and uneven terrain, became clearer. Small movements at a distance, a slight rustle in grass, a shadow at the edge of vision appeared sooner than they would have from a low position. In survival terms, recognizing danger earlier did not need to be a dramatic advantage. It only needed to be enough to trigger timely reaction. A moment sooner, a step back earlier, a quicker change of direction. Often that brief interval determined whether an individual survived to see the next day. Standing also altered how weight was distributed. When the lower limbs carried more of the body's mass during ground movement, the upper limbs no longer needed to support weight continuously. Initially, this change was unstable. Arms still played a crucial role in balance, especially on uneven ground, or when returning to trees. Yet even a slight reduction in the use of arms created new possibilities. During short ground movements, hands no longer touched the earth with every step. They could hold recently gathered food. They could carry infants for short distances. They could transport natural objects encountered along the way. These objects were not tools. They were not shaped, sharpened, or used with clear intent. But carrying them marked a subtle shift in the relationship between body and environment. For the first time, hands were not merely responding to space, they were retaining part of that space for later use. This change was neither continuous nor systematic. It occurred in scattered moments when conditions allowed. When climbing was necessary, hands returned to their previous role. When speed was required, posture could drop again. But over time, these scattered moments accumulated. Carrying food reduced pressure to consume it immediately. Carrying infants expanded movement range without constant returns. Holding a natural object even briefly laid the groundwork for more refined coordination between vision hands and bodily movement. At this stage, there was no modern concept of use, no planning, no intention. But bodies were learning something basic. Hands could do more than grip and support. And this expansion, limited as it was, would become the foundation of all later tool history. From a modern perspective, these changes may seem small, even insignificant. But within the survival context of millions of years ago, each small adjustment in observation movement and bodily use could generate significant consequences across generations. Not because it made individuals superior, but because it made a way of living better suited to a changing environment. And from these quiet adjustments, the future relationship between humans and the world began to form, not through intelligence or creativity, but through bodies learning to occupy space differently, step by step, in the silence of time. These changes did not occur everywhere. Most primate populations continued adapting to life in trees. Those branches would persist, evolving along their own trajectories, becoming the ancestors of the great apes alive today. The branch leading to humans was small, a group living at the boundary between forest and open land. They did not abandon trees entirely, but they no longer depended on them completely. Their lives unfolded in an intermediate zone, both familiar and risky. For millions of years, these creatures still displayed no traits that would justify calling them human. Their brains remained largely unchanged. Faces retained many ape-like features. Teeth and jaws were adapted to coarse, unprocessed food. Lifespans were short. Mortality was high. From a modern perspective, this period appears devoid of progress. But evolution does not aim for progress. It does not care about intelligence, morality, or creativity. It cares only whether an organism survives long enough to pass on its genes. And in a changing world, individuals who stood at the right moments, moved more efficiently on the ground, and observed their surroundings more effectively, had higher survival chances, not because they were better, but because they were more suited to their specific conditions. One of the most important aspects of this period is the sequence of change. Locomotion changed first. Bodies adapted first. The brain remained largely static for a very long time. This contradicts the common intuition that intelligence was the primary driver of human evolution. In reality, humans learned to walk upright millions of years before they learned to think complexly. The skeleton, spine, pelvis, legs began transforming very early to support bipedal movement. These changes accumulated slowly across countless generations and never appeared dramatic in any single moment. There was no collective memory, no stories passed down. Each generation was born, lived its short life, and vanished without knowing that its unconscious choices were shaping a trajectory millions of years long. They did not know that distant future beings would look back and call them ancestors. For them, each day consisted only of immediate responses to environment. Find food, avoid danger, survive the dry season, survive the night. If we could observe the entire scene at that time, we would not witness the birth of humanity. We would see only a primate species trying not to be eliminated in an increasingly unpredictable world. No ambition, no grand purpose, only incremental adaptation. And that is precisely what makes this period important. It laid the groundwork for everything that followed, not through intelligence or civilization, but through humbler things: how to stand, how to step, and how to exist in an environment no longer stable. The next chapter begins when these changes cease to be random experiments, when bipedalism becomes a stable trait, when we can first name a specific group within this lineage. Around 4 million years ago, the early hominins, Australopithecus, appeared. And from there, the evolutionary history of humanity begins to come into clearer focus. No longer just faint traces in bone, but a path slowly taking shape. When the story of evolution reaches roughly 4 million years ago, the picture begins to sharpen. It is no longer only a faint trace of a distant split. For the first time, we can name a specific group of beings within the lineage that leads to humans. Today, we call them the earliest humans, Australopithecus. That name does not imply intelligence, nor does it evoke the image of a fully formed human. It reflects a far more modest reality. These were beings who lived in southern Africa during the Pliocene, carrying a mix of traits that feel both familiar and strange. They were no longer purely tree dwellers, but they were not yet inhabitants of the open savanna either. They existed at the boundary between two worlds. The Pliocene was a period that continued a climate transformation already underway for millions of years, but here those changes became more visible in the daily experience of living creatures. The climate did not collapse overnight, and it did not shift into an entirely new state all at once. It drifted little by little, slow enough for life to adapt, yet deep enough to force every species to adjust how it existed. Forests still remained, but they were no longer continuous the way they once had been. Tree cover that had stretched in unbroken expanses became fragmented by widening open gaps. Between forest patches lay low grasslands, sparse shrubs, and open ground where sunlight struck the surface directly for much of the day. The landscape stopped being uniform. It became a mosaic, with each piece offering different living conditions. In such an environment, no single survival strategy could work everywhere. Skills that were effective in dense woodland could become less useful in open ground, and traits that supported movement on the ground were not always helpful when a return to trees was necessary. A creature had to face constant uncertainty, where each day might demand a different response. Food reflected that fragmentation. Fruit no longer appeared reliably in every area. Young leaves and roots might be abundant in one patch of woodland, yet scarce only a short distance away. Foraging became a more mobile process, demanding flexible search rather than reliance on a fixed source. Individuals unable to adjust their range of movement were more likely to fall into energy deficits. The pressure did not come only from finding food, but also from danger. Open ground reduced the ability to hide. Predators could appear abruptly from far away. Moving between forest patches forced animals to expose themselves in empty space, where every mistake carried a higher cost. Safety was no longer tied to a single dependable place. It became a temporary condition dependent on the ability to detect threats and react quickly. In this mosaic environment, flexibility became the key to survival. Not raw strength, not larger size, but the ability to change how one moved, how one foraged, and how one used the space around them. Creatures capable of adapting to multiple conditions, even minimally, had a better chance of persisting than creatures specialized for only one habitat. The Pliocene did not reward rigid strategies. It rewarded small adjustments that accumulated slowly, sometimes almost invisibly, within a single lifetime. But across thousands of generations, those adjustments produced clear differences. One species could survive long enough to continue changing, while another, though once well suited to the old world, gradually fell behind. For the lineage that would eventually lead to humans, the Pliocene was not the setting of a dramatic leap. It was the setting of slow abrasion. Each day, each dry season, each journey between forest patches forced bodies to use energy more efficiently, forced behavior to become more flexible. There were no perfect choices, only choices good enough to survive one more generation. And within that long instability, the traits that would later shape humanity began to be cultivated not through intelligence or creativity, but through adaptation in a world that would not hold still. Australopithecus emerged within this mosaic environment not as conquerors, but as the outcome of a long process of adjustment. Fossils show that they were no longer merely occasionally upright the way earlier ancestors had been. Bipedal walking had persisted long enough across enough generations to become a stable feature of their bodily structure. Their pelvis was shorter and wider, forming a more solid base to support body weight while upright. The spine was no longer straight in the way it is in four-limbed primates, but began to curve into a rough, early S-shape. This curve helped distribute weight from head to hips, to legs, reducing stress on individual joints during walking. Knees and ankles also changed, taking load more along a vertical axis, rather than dispersing it as before. These changes did not make Australopithecus walk smoothly or quickly like modern humans. Their gait was still slow and cautious, not fully stable in rhythm. But they could stand and travel on two legs across distances long enough that it was no longer an exception. It became part of daily life. What matters, though, is this: walking on two legs did not mean abandoning trees. Australopithecus did not leave the forest in an absolute sense. Their bodies still carried clear traces of life above the ground. Their arms were longer relative to modern humans, allowing them to reach and grip securely while climbing. The shoulders and shoulder joints retained flexible structures suited for hanging, swinging, and moving among branches. Their hands were not delicate, but strong enough to grip and bear body weight. And their feet, though partly adapted for bipedal movement, still retained a degree of flexibility in the big toe. That toe was not fully aligned with the others, allowing it to assist in gripping branches or trunks. This shows that Australopithecus lived neither fully on the ground nor fully in the trees. They lived in an in-between state where each space served a different purpose. The ground was where they moved between forest patches, searched for dispersed food, and scanned wider open terrain. Trees were where they took refuge, rested, and avoided danger, especially at night. Living between two worlds demanded a body that was flexible rather than specialized. Australopithecus was not as agile as primates that lived entirely in trees, but not entirely clumsy on the ground either. They did not excel in either space, yet they were adapted enough not to be eliminated immediately in both. That fragile balance shaped how they lived. Each day was a sequence of transitions from canopy to ground, and then back again. Living space was not fixed. It shifted with the time of day, with the seasons, and with the distribution of food. The body of Australopithecus reflects that rhythm with traits not fully specialized, yet sufficient to sustain existence in an unstable environment. From an evolutionary perspective, this was a crucial stage. With bipedal walking established, but older abilities not yet discarded, the lineage retained the flexibility it needed to keep changing. If they had abandoned trees too early, predation risk could have exceeded their ability to cope. If they had clung entirely to tree life, they could not have exploited the advantages of moving across open ground. Australopithecus survived within that narrow balance. Not as a pinnacle, not as a leap, but as a foundation, a body accustomed to standing upright without losing the biological memory of life above. And it is from this foundation that deeper changes could later emerge as environments continued to shift and survival pressure continued to rise. This in-between existence is the defining feature of Australopithecus. By day, they could move across the ground to forage, crossing open gaps between forest patches. When safety mattered, they returned to the trees to rest and escape predators. Their habitat demanded flexible switching, and their bodies reflect that demand. The brain of Australopithecus remained small, only slightly larger than that of other primates. There is no sign of a rapid rise in intelligence at this stage. The face projected forward. The jaw was powerful, the teeth large, suited to a coarse diet of tough plant matter roots and unprocessed foods. Life was still tightly bound to the search for enough energy simply to keep the body alive. But even if the brain had not expanded, the body was already beginning to carry the outline of a new way of living. Stable bipedal walking could save energy over longer distances on the ground. Compared with moving on 4 limbs, this posture could also help the body shed heat more effectively under direct sunlight in open terrain. And it raised the head, expanding the field of view, making it easier to detect both food and danger earlier. These advantages did not turn Australopithecus into rulers of their environment. They remained prey for many large predators. Mortality stayed high. Lifespans remained short. But across thousands of generations, individuals who walked more efficiently on 2 legs tended to survive and reproduce more often, not because they were better, but because they were slightly more suited to the particular world they faced. One of the most important discoveries that helps us understand this stage more clearly is fossilized footprints preserved in ancient ground. They are not striking artifacts in a visual sense. They carry no refined lines, no symbols. They are only shallow depressions in what was once wet mud, later hardened and preserved across millions of years. Yet that simplicity is exactly what gives them extraordinary value. Footprints show how the foot contacted the ground, the sequence of weight-bearing points, and the direction the body moved. They allow researchers to determine that weight was no longer distributed across 4 limbs, as in quadrupedal primates. Instead, force passed primarily through the heel and then rolled forward across the foot, one of the core signatures of bipedal walking. Though still crude, that pattern shows a body growing accustomed to lifting its center of gravity higher. Steps were no longer short leaps between grasping points. They became a continuous sequence, each step following the last on the same plane. This reflects a major change in how the animal related to the ground, from treating the ground as a temporary space to using it as a regular part of movement. These traces do not tell us about intelligence, emotion, or inner life. They say nothing about language, self-awareness, or culture. But they tell another story, quieter and more fundamental. They tell the story of a body's rhythm, its speed, its weight shifting from one foot to the other, the mechanics of balance. They tell us that a creature learned to trust the ground beneath it. Each footprint was only a brief moment in one individual's life, a step made and then gone. But when those moments are frozen in stone and preserved across millions of years, they become the most direct evidence that bipedal walking was no longer a hypothesis. It happened. It was repeated often enough to leave a record. And these footprints are not perfect. They do not show the upright, balanced, efficient gait of modern humans. Some steps look uneven, the spacing is not entirely regular. That reflects a transitional stage where the body was still adapting, still learning how to distribute force and maintain balance in varying conditions. That imperfection is part of what makes them valuable. They show that evolution does not proceed through instant completion. It proceeds through repeated experiments where each generation adjusts slightly from the one before. There was no correct walk from the beginning, only steps good enough to keep moving forward. When we look at these fossil footprints, we do not see a species marching toward civilization. We see a creature learning to survive on changing ground. And from those modest rhythms of movement, the path toward modern humans began to take shape, not through intellect or intention, but through the patient repetition of one step after another across time. What is notable is that throughout the long existence of Australopithecus, stone tools had not yet appeared. There is no evidence of deliberate tool making or tool use. The relationship between hand and environment remained mostly direct, grasping, clinging, picking up, carrying. The freeing of the hands had not yet produced technology, but it was laying the foundation for a capacity that would emerge much later. Social life among Australopithecus, if we can call it that, was still very simple. They may have lived in small groups, as many primates do today, increasing their ability to detect danger and protect infants. But there is no evidence for a complex organization or clearly defined social roles. Communication, if present, likely relied on simple sounds and gestures. Each day for Australopithecus was not very different from the day before. Find food when hungry, move. When the environment forced movement, take shelter when danger appeared. There was no long-term plan, no concept of the future. Life unfolded in a short loop, tightly tied to natural conditions. From a modern perspective, it can be difficult to see the importance of this stage. There were no inventions, no art, no language. But something essential was established here. Bipedal walking was no longer a temporary response, it became the biological foundation. Every later change in the human lineage would unfold upon that foundation. That has deep implications. Once bipedalism stabilized, the body could continue changing in other directions. Hands could gradually become more refined. The skull could slowly expand. But without this stage, later developments would not have been possible. Australopithecus was not the first human, but they laid the groundwork for every possibility that would come after. For hundreds of thousands, then millions of years, Australopithecus persisted, adapted, and eventually vanished. They did not know what role they played in a longer story. For them, each generation was simply a chain of survival days, one after another. Yet that persistence, quiet, unglamorous, kept the lineage from breaking. When Australopithecus faded from the evolutionary picture, they left no cities, no tools, no symbols. What they left was a body accustomed to standing upright, walking across the ground, and using the hands differently than before. It was a silent inheritance, but a decisive one. The next chapter of the story begins when another change appears, not in gait, but in the relationship between hand and matter. More than 2 million years ago, a new species emerges with a larger brain and the ability to shape the first tools from stone. That is when Homo habilis, the handyman, enters the evolutionary record. And from there, the path toward modern humans begins to accelerate in a way Australopithecus never experienced. Australopithecus laid the groundwork for a new kind of walking, but they did not go beyond it. For hundreds of thousands, then millions of years, that stable bipedal gait persisted with almost no change. The brain remained small. Life still revolved around finding food and avoiding danger. From the outside, this lineage seemed to have reached a biological equilibrium, a body adapted well enough to survive, but with nothing pushing it toward a different direction of development. Then the environment kept changing. Survival pressure did not ease. Food did not become more abundant. Open ground expanded, and with it came increasingly intense competition among predators. At that moment, relying only on bipedal walking and the ability to climb was no longer enough to guarantee the long-term survival of this lineage. It was in that context that another change appeared. Not in the legs, not in the gait, but in the relationship between the hand and matter, a small shift whose consequences would spread across the entire human story that followed. It was the moment when stone stopped being only part of the landscape and began to become part of behavior. The emergence of Homo habilis. Between roughly 2.6 and 2.2 million years ago in Africa, the fossil record begins to register the appearance of a new species in the lineage leading to humans. Today, this species is called Homo habilis, the handy man, the skillful man. That name is not meant to praise intelligence or creativity in a modern sense. It simply describes a very specific, very modest change. With deep implications, the hand began to be used differently. Compared with Australopithecus, Homo habilis was not dramatically taller. Their bodies were still small, lean, and carried many traits of a primate living in a harsh environment. But if you look closely, subtle differences begin to surface. Their hands were more flexible. Their fingers could grasp with greater precision, not only to cling or carry, but to hold an object in a more stable, controlled way. The wrist and finger joints allowed finer movements than those of earlier ancestors. The skull of Homo habilis was also slightly larger. This increase was not sudden, and it was not enough to produce a species that was intelligent in the modern sense. But it reflected a clear trend. Brain volume was slowly rising. The brain began to claim a larger share of the body's total energy, something that can only happen when diet and survival behavior have shifted enough to supply the energy demanded by such an expensive organ. Yet the most important change does not lie in a measurement of cranial capacity. It lies in how the brain and the hand began to coordinate in everyday behavior. Before this, the hand was primarily a biological tool, gripping, pulling, carrying, and supporting. The brain governed those actions directly, reflexively, tightly bound to immediate situations. With Homo habilis, that relationship began to change. For the first time in the history of this lineage, a creature did not merely respond to the environment. It actively produced a small change in the environment in order to serve its needs. When a stone was selected and struck to create a sharp edge, that was not just a mechanical action. It required recognizing that the shape of an object could be altered to produce a new function. Even if the behavior was simple and could be repeated in a crude way, it marked the arrival of a new kind of interaction between body and world, and there was no long-term planning here. No design held in the mind, no conscious sense of "I am making a tool." But a new link formed. The eye observed the stone's form, the hand acted upon it, and the brain registered the result. If a sharp edge brought advantage, the behavior could be repeated. If it did not, it was abandoned. Over time, effective sequences of action were retained, not through abstract thought, but through survival experience. This hand-brain coordination created a new feedback loop in evolution. The hand enabled minimal changes to the environment. The altered environment created new nutritional opportunities. Those opportunities supplied more energy to the brain, and a brain with more available energy gained a slightly greater capacity to guide the hand with precision. This was not a leap. It was a slow loop repeating across thousands of generations. What is striking is that Homo habilis still lived within very clear limits. They did not control the environment. They did not dominate their habitat. They still depended on what nature left behind. But unlike before, they began to exploit parts of the environment that other species could not access as easily, not through strength, but through manual skill. From a modern perspective, these changes may seem small, even trivial. But within an evolutionary timescale of millions of years, this was one of the most important turning points. It marks the moment when the human lineage began not only to adapt to the world, but to intervene in the world however limited that intervention was. And from that modest intervention, the path toward tools technology and eventually culture was opened. Oldowan tools. The earliest stone tools we find are called Oldowan tools. They do not look like objects that were designed. There is no clear symmetry, no standardized form, no sign that the maker cared about aesthetics or refinement. If you place them beside later stone industries, Oldowan artifacts appear almost rough and accidental. In essence, they were often just a core stone, and a few flakes broken from that core. The toolmaker chose a stone hard enough, often basalt quartz or other materials that fracture, to produce sharp edges. Then they struck it against another hard surface, or used another stone as a hammer, producing fragments whose edges were naturally sharp. There was no multi-step process, no long-term plan. Each strike was experimental. If a flake came off with an edge sharp enough to cut, it was kept. If not, it was discarded. That is why every Oldowan tool is different. No two are exactly alike because they were not produced from a fixed template. These flakes typically had one or several sharp edges, enough to slice, hide-cut meat, or scrape soft tissue. They were not durable. The edge could dull quickly. But in the moment of use, they provided an advantage the bare hand could not. They allowed the user to access meat left on animal carcasses, or to peel away hide and tissue to reach the marrow inside bones. Notably, Oldowan tools did not necessarily need to be carried for long periods. They could be made on the spot, used briefly, and abandoned. Many archaeological sites show dense concentrations of shattered flakes, as if napping occurred right where a carcass was found. This reflects a flexible way of life in which tools were not personal property, but a temporary part of survival behavior. The crude structure of Oldowan tools also shows how direct the relationship was between user and material. There was little distance between intention and action. The toolmaker did not need to imagine a final form in advance. They only had to recognize that a sharp edge could do what bare hands could not. When the edge lost its effect, the tool lost its value. From a modern point of view, these tools can look so primitive, it is hard to believe they mark a major turning point. Yet their simplicity is precisely what makes Oldowan so important. They represent the first time in the history of the human lineage that an inanimate object was deliberately altered to extend the body's capabilities. Oldowan was not technology in a complex sense. It did not require formal learning or systematic instruction, but it established a new way of thinking that the surrounding physical world could be interfered with, however slightly, to serve survival needs. And from those rough flakes of stone, the entire later history of human tools would slowly be built. Tools scavenging in a new energy balance. There is no evidence that Homo habilis made tools for hunting. They were not efficient hunters. Their bodies were not fast enough, not strong enough to bring down large prey. Instead, stone tools served a far more practical purpose, processing animal carcasses. Cut marks on fossilized bones show that Homo habilis used stone to slice meat left on carcasses abandoned by other predators. They smashed bones to reach marrow, an extremely nutrient-rich energy source. This was not noble behavior, and it was not creativity for its own sake. It was a direct response to a basic need hunger. But from that need, a new evolutionary loop began to form. Access to higher energy food, especially animal flesh and bone marrow, quietly changed the diet of this lineage in a way that carried deep implications. Before this, for many millions of years, primate diets relied largely on coarse plant matter, seasonal fruit, young leaves, roots, and other low-energy foods. Such foods could sustain the body, but they did not generate surplus energy. The brain is a special organ. Compared to the rest of the body, it consumes a very large amount of energy simply to function. Even in modern humans, the brain is a small fraction of body mass, yet consumes a significant share of daily energy. In early evolution, when food was scarce and unstable, supporting a larger brain was a biological burden. That is why, for millions of years before Homo habilis, brain size did not increase dramatically. Not because evolution didn't want intelligence, but because the environment could not reliably supply enough energy to sustain a larger brain without weakening other systems. The body could only allocate energy within tight limits. The emergence of stone tools shifted that balance. With sharp flakes, Homo habilis could access meat left on carcasses that other predators abandoned. More importantly, they could crack bones to extract marrow. Marrow is one of the richest energy sources in nature, dense in fat and critical nutrients. Before tools, most of that nutrition was nearly unreachable. Bone is too hard for primate hands and teeth to open reliably. But with a sharp edge and enough striking force, that boundary could be broken. This did not transform Homo habilis into great hunters, but it did make them more effective extractors of what the environment left behind. Dietary change did not happen all at once, and it was not stable. There were not carcasses every day. There was not marrow every time. But even occasional access to high-energy food raises the average energy intake over time. And in evolution, small shifts repeated across generations are what matter. With that additional energy, the body gained a little more biological room. The brain could maintain function more steadily. A very slow increase in brain volume became possible. This was not an explosion of intelligence. Homo habilis did not suddenly think abstractly or plan far ahead. But the biological constraints that had long limited brain growth began to loosen. It must be emphasized, nutrition does not directly create intelligence. It only creates the conditions in which a brain can exist and change. Cognitive changes, if they occur, unfold over vast time, across hundreds of thousands of generations. But without dietary change, those changes simply cannot happen. The combination of stone tools and new nutrition created an important evolutionary feedback loop. Tools allowed access to richer energy. Richer energy supported brain maintenance and growth. A brain slightly better able to process and coordinate could make tool use marginally more effective, even if only in modest ways. This loop did not accelerate quickly, but it did not reverse. From this point onward, human evolution was no longer shaped only by the natural environment in a purely passive way. It began to be shaped by the behaviors this lineage itself produced, not through culture or complex technology, but through small adjustments in how energy was extracted from the world. And within that quiet shift, the biological foundation for larger future leaps was laid not by innate genius, but because the body finally had enough energy to allow intelligence to appear and persist. The order of events matters. It was not a bigger brain that produced tools. It was tools that produced a new diet, and a new diet that made further brain development possible. Before Homo habilis, the hand was mainly for climbing, carrying, and direct manipulation of the environment. With stone tools, the hand began to become a mediator between body and world. Stone was no longer only picked up and put down. It was selected, struck, used for a specific purpose, That process required coordination between eye-hand and short-term memory. No long-term plan, no language, but enough capacity to recognize that a sharp flake could do what bare hands could not. This was foundational. It opened the possibility that the environment was no longer only something future humans would adapt to passively, but something that could be adjusted, however minimally. #limits repetition and a new path. Life for Homo habilis remained extremely precarious. They did not build permanent shelters. They had no fire, no complex social organization. Small groups moved with food sources, much like other primates. Stone tools were not carried long-term. They could be used and left behind. There is no evidence of hoarding or systematic passing down of tools across generations. But the repeated use of them was frequent enough to form an early behavioral tradition. Each generation learned by observing and imitating. There was no teaching in the modern sense, only the repetition of behaviors that worked. Homo habilis was not modern human. They did not have abstract thinking, no art, no ritual. Their brain, though larger than Australopithecus, was still very small compared with later Homo sapiens, but they carried something new, a potential. When the hand and brain began to coordinate around an object outside the body, a new road opened. That road would not develop immediately. It would take hundreds of thousands of years, then millions to lead toward more refined tools fire and ultimately culture. This chapter is not about intelligence in a grand sense. It is about something far simpler: scarcity. Not about invention for its own sake, but about how a creature responded to prolonged hunger in a world that offered no kindness. There are no geniuses here, no big ideas, only specific choices made to stay alive one more day. Yet from those simple behaviors, a new path began to form. When stone was used to cut, when bone was struck to reach marrow. Human history quietly changed direction, not through spectacular leaps, but through a slight deviation in survival strategy. And that deviation over time opened the entire story that would come next. From this point onward, human evolution was no longer only a story of the body. It became a story of the relationship between body and matter. Stone became an extension of the hand, and the hand, for the first time, began to extend the limits of itself. The next chapter will continue that path when a new species appears with fully upright posture, a taller body, and the ability to leave Africa and enter a wider world. Homo erectus, the upright walker, and the transition from local survival to a global journey. When Chapter 3 closed, the evolutionary history of humankind had already turned onto a new path. It was no longer only a story of gait or of rough flakes of stone. A new relationship had been established between the hand matter and energy. Yet that change still unfolded within a narrow range of Africa, where a familiar environment was just stable enough to sustain a precarious but continuous way of life. Around 1.9 million years ago, a larger shift began. This time, it was not merely a slight adjustment in behavior or anatomy. This was the period when the human body truly stepped into a new structure. A structure that made long-distance movement possible, improved endurance, and allowed survival in environments this lineage had never before entered. This was the moment the upright walker appeared. Compared to earlier ancestors, the upright walker carried a clearly different form, not only in size, but in the way the whole body was reorganized to serve a new way of living. This was no longer a creature experimenting with bipedal movement. This was a body that had accepted that posture as its default state of existence. A taller body lifted the line of sight above the ground, expanding the field of observation in open landscapes. But height alone was not decisive. What mattered was proportion. Legs noticeably longer than arms signaled that the lower limbs were no longer primarily for support, but for continuous travel across long distances. The arms, in contrast, no longer held the central role in locomotion. They gradually became instruments for handling and reshaping the environment. The skeleton of the upright walker was reorganized toward endurance. The pelvis was narrower than an Australopithecus, making long-distance walking more efficient. The hip and knee joints were arranged so that force from the upper body traveled down the legs along a straighter axis, reducing wasted energy with every step. This was not a random improvement. It was the result of prolonged survival pressure in an environment where one had to travel farther and farther to find food. Long legs provided a crucial advantage. Each step covered more ground. This meant that with the same energy expenditure, the upright walker could travel farther than earlier ancestors. In a world where food sources were scattered and unstable, the ability to go far was not convenience, it was a condition of existence. The feet, too, revealed deep change. A clear arch began to form, allowing impact to be absorbed and distributed at each landing. This reduced shock traveling up into the legs and spine, enabling the body to endure long periods of walking. A larger, sturdier heel became the first point of contact with the ground, one of the key features of efficient bipedal gait. The spine of the upright walker developed a more complete curvature than earlier human forms. This curve was not about standing straight in an aesthetic sense. It was about balance, about stabilizing the upper body when the center of mass was higher and in constant motion. With a curved spine, head and torso could remain relatively steady while the legs repeated step after step. This was a foundational change, enabling sustained movement without exhausting the musculoskeletal system. None of these traits existed in isolation. They linked together into a single integrated system. Long legs, arched feet, hips, knees, and a curved spine worked in concert to create a body capable of walking for hours, perhaps for entire days, without collapsing from fatigue. That is what the upright walker represents, not a set of minor adjustments, but a comprehensive restructuring. Their face, too, began to reflect this new way of life. The jaw remained strong because the diet still involved coarse, largely unprocessed food that demanded heavy chewing. But the face no longer projected forward as dramatically as in Homo habilis. This shift was partly connected to how the head balanced atop the spine. As bipedal posture became stable, the head no longer needed to thrust forward to maintain balance, as it does in many four-limbed primates. The upright walker's skull was larger than Homo habilis's, indicating that brain volume continued to increase. But this increase was gradual, not a sudden leap. The brain still had not reached the level required for complex abstract thought. However, the stability of the entire body created an important foundation. The body no longer had to struggle simply to exist from one step to the next. When movement became more efficient and less energetically costly, resources could be redistributed to other functions, including the brain. It must be emphasized the upright walker's transformation did not aim to produce a more intelligent creature immediately. It aimed to produce a creature that could endure a larger, harsher world. Intelligence, if it could develop, would be a long-term consequence of a body stable enough to withstand prolonged survival pressure. From an evolutionary perspective, the upright walker represents a critical transition from a creature adapted to local conditions to a creature built for continuous movement and an expanding living space. Their body was not yet the perfect image of modern humans, but it was the first time this lineage possessed a form durable enough to step beyond the familiar boundary. And from that body, the first long human journeys began not by superior intellect, but by steady, repeated steps carried across thousands of generations along roads that had no names. The upright walker was not the fastest creature in their environment. They had no claws, no long fangs, no explosive acceleration. But they possessed something else: endurance. The ability to move steadily over long distances under direct sun became a decisive advantage. An upright body reduced the surface area exposed to the overhead sun, while sweating regulated body temperature more effectively than many other predators could manage. In a world where pursuing prey or searching for food required constant movement, endurance became a rational survival strategy. This did not turn the upright walker into a perfect hunter, but it allowed them to persist in open environments where traveling far was no longer an unbearable risk. And that ability opened the door to an event unprecedented in the history of this lineage, leaving Africa. Around 1.8 million years ago, the first upright walker groups began to appear beyond Africa. Their traces have been found across multiple regions from the Middle East to East Asia. This was not a planned migration. There were no maps, no clear goal, only steps following steps, generation after generation, gradually expanding the range of habitation. Leaving Africa introduced entirely new challenges: different climates, lower temperatures in many regions, harsher winters, unfamiliar plants and animals. Survival strategies that had been sufficient in Africa no longer guaranteed success in new lands. But the upright walker carried an essential advantage: flexibility. Their body was durable enough to travel far. Their behavior was simple enough to adjust quickly. And the relationship between hand and tool established in the previous phase was already in place, ready to expand. At this stage, stone tools began to show clearer change. They were no longer merely random broken stones. Tools were shaped more carefully, with more stable forms and sharp edges maintained along multiple sides. They allowed cutting, chopping, and processing materials more efficiently. This shift did not reflect a sudden leap in intelligence. It reflected accumulated experience. When a tool form proved effective, it could be repeated. No systematic teaching was required, only observation and imitation. Over time, effective shapes became familiar. This marks an important difference from earlier stages. Tools were no longer purely situational. They began to carry a rudimentary tradition. A group could use similar tool types for long enough to leave a clear archaeological signature. One of the most consequential elements associated with the upright walker is the use of fire. Not in the sense of inventing it, because fire had existed in nature long before appearing after lightning wildfires or volcanic activity. The breakthrough was not in seeing fire, but in keeping it from going out, pulling it from the random domain of nature, and placing it into the daily rhythm of human life. For the upright walker, fire was not a symbol, and it did not yet hold sacred or cultural meaning. It was a resource, a tool of survival. And like every other tool in this period, its value lay in direct concrete effects, not in abstract significance. Fire brought light into darkness. But this was not merely about seeing better. Before Fire Night was a time humans could scarcely control. Vision collapsed. Danger became harder to read. Activity had to stop when the sun went down. Night was an interval of helplessness between 2 days of living. When fire appeared and was maintained, night ceased to be an absolute boundary. The weak light of flame did not banish darkness completely, but it created a zone of relative safety, a small space where humans could remain, observe, and respond to what surrounded them. That alone profoundly altered a survival rhythm once locked into the day-night cycle. Fire also brought warmth, especially important as the upright walker began moving into cooler and colder climates. Previously, the range of this lineage had been limited largely by temperature. With fire, those limits began to loosen. Humans no longer depended entirely on body heat and sparse body hair to resist the cold. But perhaps the deepest impact of fire lay in cooking. When food is cooked, its structure changes. Meat becomes softer. Tough plant material becomes easier to chew and digest. Bacteria and parasites are reduced to some extent. This not only lowers the risk of illness, it also allows the body to extract energy more efficiently from the same amount of food. The consequences are profoundly biological. When food is easier to digest, the body does not need to spend as much energy on digestion. That saved energy can be redirected to other functions, including the brain. This is not an immediate rise in intelligence, but it is a crucial biological adjustment that supports a larger body and a brain continuing to grow. The space around a fire also produced a subtle but lasting change in how humans stayed together. Before this, individuals often scattered at night, finding isolated shelter or climbing trees to avoid danger. With fire, multiple individuals could remain close for longer periods, not because of modern community consciousness, but for practical advantage, greater safety, greater warmth, and greater environmental control. Staying close for longer created new interactions. Sounds, gestures, and simple forms of communication had more time to unfold. This was not yet language, not yet culture, but it was a shift in social rhythm. Nighttime, once a forced silence, became an extension of daytime life. It is important to stress fire did not appear everywhere at once, nor was its use stable from the start. There may have been periods when humans used fire and then lost it. Some groups maintained fire longer than others. But over time, the ability to control fire and pass on its use gradually became part of survival behavior. Fire did not make the upright walker superior overnight. They still faced hunger, disease, and danger. But fire altered the balance. It stretched the usable day. It widened the survivable world. It gave the body and the social group more time to adjust, to refine, and to accumulate experience. From this point onward, human evolution no longer unfolded only in daylight. A vital part of it unfolded around the flame within darkness, partially pushed back where human rhythm began to exceed old biological limits. Not through innate brilliance, but through the ability to keep a fire from dying. The use of fire also allowed the upright walker to enter colder regions. They were no longer confined to tropical climates. This greatly expanded their range and laid the groundwork for later migration waves of the human lineage. Life for the upright walker remained full of risk. They did not build cities. They had no permanent shelters that lasted long. Small groups moved according to food and environmental conditions. But compared to earlier phases, their world had become vastly larger. Each generation was born into a living space larger than the generation before. Descendants could travel farther than their ancestors. Paths no longer closed within a single familiar region. For the first time in the history of this lineage, the idea of the world began to expand geographically. Despite these innovations, the upright walker still had clear limits. Their brain was not yet large enough for complex abstract thought. There is no evidence of art or ritual. Communication, if it existed, remained largely based on simple sounds and gestures. They left no stories, no symbols. What they left behind were bones, tools, and traces of long journeys. Yet those traces reveal something decisive. The human lineage had stepped beyond its biological cradle and learned to persist in a world larger, more diverse, and more unpredictable. This chapter is not about intelligence or culture in a lofty sense. It is about the body, about endurance, about the ability to travel far and withstand hardship. But it is from those seemingly rough traits that human history begins to take on a global scale. From this point onward, Humans were no longer completely bound to a single environment. They could move, adjust, and survive in many different places. This is the transition from a regional primate to a lineage capable of presence on a continental scale. The next chapter will continue that story as the brain continues to develop. Society begins to take clearer form, and relationships between humans become more complex. It is the period when archaic human species diversify, when the biological foundation is ready for deeper shifts in perception and behavior. When the upright walker stepped out of Africa and spread across many parts of Eurasia, human evolution was no longer only a story of movement and adaptation to new environments. Around 1 million years ago, a deeper shift began to take shape, not loudly, with no clear milestone, yet persistent enough to reshape how humans lived with one another, not only with the world around them. This was the period when archaic human populations, descendants of the upright walker, began to remain in the same regions long enough to form a shared rhythm of life. No longer only small groups that came together temporarily around food and then dissolved. No longer only journeys strung together without direction. A form of early society, fragile but longer lasting, began to appear. Around 1 million years ago, Earth entered a rhythm that grew increasingly severe. The climate no longer remained stable across long cycles as before. Cold and warm phases alternated with greater amplitude, more pronounced, more disruptive, and harder to predict. These changes did not unfold within a single human lifetime, but they moved fast enough that each generation faced a world slightly different from the one before. In many regions, winters grew longer, not only colder, but drier. Water became scarce for extended periods. The ground cracked during dry seasons, then froze or hardened when temperatures fell. Plant life no longer developed evenly. There were years when grass grew low and sparse. Years when trees bore no fruit. Food sources that had once been reliable could vanish for multiple seasons in a row. This harshness did not take the shape of a single catastrophe. It was slow abrasion. Each winter lasted a little longer. Each drought arrived a little earlier. And each time the margin of safety for life narrowed a little more. Animals migrated along routes that became increasingly unpredictable. Large herds no longer appeared regularly in the same places. Smaller species either disappeared or altered their living patterns. As a result, relying on any fixed food source became risky. Survival was no longer a matter of one isolated skill, but the capacity to adapt continually to an environment that would not stop changing. In a world like this, solitary survival became a dangerous gamble. A single individual, even a strong one, could hardly observe every threat, find enough food, protect offspring, and keep fire alive in adverse weather. It took only a minor injury, one failed hunt, or a night colder than expected for the risk to become irreversible. The darkness of long winters also carried new dangers. Hungry predators grew more reckless. Nights without fire became more dangerous than ever. Keeping a flame from dying in cold wind and rain or snow demanded constant watchfulness, a task nearly impossible to sustain alone. It was within this context that survival pressure began to push humans closer together. Not from affection or community consciousness in the modern sense, but from efficiency. Many eyes watched better than one. Many bodies retained heat better than one. Many hands kept fire alive more easily than one. Staying together reduced individual risk. Food, when available, could be shared to get through lean days. Offspring were better protected when multiple adults were present. Danger was detected earlier when more people stood watch. And when one individual weakened, the group could still continue. The Earth's harshness at this time did not teach humans morality or community. It simply posed a cold equation: stay together or accept higher risk through each unforgiving season. And over time, groups that stayed together, even for immediate practical benefit, had more chances to survive. So living together did not arise from ideals. It arose from climate, from long winters, from unpredictable food, from cold nights that offered no mercy. In such a world, cohesion was not a spiritual choice. It was a survival strategy forced into existence by the environment. And from that invisible pressure of the earth, humans began to enter a new phase, no longer existing as solitary individuals, but as groups that persisted across time, laying the groundwork for society later on. One of the clearest signs of this period appears in stone tools. If earlier Oldowan tools were situational, crude, and short-term, then around 1 million years ago, Acheulean tools became more widespread across many regions. These tools were no longer random, sharp flakes made and discarded. They had more stable, recognizable forms, and most importantly, they could be made again in the same way. Bifacial hand axes with elongated bodies and two edges shaped into a roughly symmetrical form appear repeatedly at many archaeological sites, separated by hundreds, sometimes thousands of kilometers. This was not accidental. To make such a tool, the maker had to carry out a particular sequence of actions, selecting suitable stone, choosing a direction of flaking, removing unnecessary pieces, and maintaining an overall form throughout the process. No abstract concept of design was required, but a behavioral template had to be remembered and repeated. The point is not whether the tools were beautiful or balanced by modern standards. Their value lies in stability. When the same type of tool appears across generations, it suggests that tool-making behavior was no longer purely situational. It had become a familiar part of life, reproducible whenever needed, instead of being invented from scratch each time. This repetition reflects an important shift in how humans learned. Language was not needed to explain. No verbal instruction was required, but a young individual living long enough within a group could watch others nap stone, remember the sequence, and attempt to imitate it. The process was imperfect, but over time, the most effective methods were retained. This was a very early form of social learning. It did not depend on intentional teaching, but on prolonged co-presence of individuals within the same group. If groups dissolved too quickly, such behavior would be difficult to maintain. So, the stability of tools indirectly reflects the stability of the groups that use them. When a tool tradition persists long enough, it begins to extend beyond the individual. It becomes characteristic of an entire population. People living in the same region across many generations share a familiar way of making things, not because they know it is tradition, but because it is the method that has proven effective in the environment they inhabit. This marks the emergence of what researchers call behavioral traditions. It is not culture in the modern sense. There are no symbols, no conscious preservation, but there is continuity behaviors repeated, not only as reflex, but because they have become the familiar way of the group. These behavioral traditions matter profoundly. They allow knowledge to escape the limits of a single lifetime. When one individual dies, the behavior can still continue in the group as long as others have watched and learned. This is the first step toward knowledge outliving the individual, even if only in a modest way. More importantly, the existence of behavioral traditions shows that humans began to live in a world shaped not only by natural environments, but also by habits they themselves generated. How to nap stone, how to use tools, how to approach food. All of this became part of the social environment that each new individual had to learn to navigate. From an evolutionary perspective, this is a quiet but deep transition. The body is no longer the only place where the history of adaptation is stored. Part of that history begins to be stored in the repeated behavior of the group. And from these stable behavioral templates, more complex forms of culture will gradually gain room to emerge over the hundreds of thousands of years that follow. At around 1 million years ago, humans did not yet tell stories, draw images, or leave symbols. But they left traces of something new, behaviors repeated long enough to become a shared memory, even though no one was conscious of it. And those invisible memories would become the foundation for human history later. Archaeological evidence suggests that in this period, humans were not only passively scavenging animal carcasses. In some regions, traces point to more organized involvement in exploiting large animals. Not finely planned hunting yet, but simple cooperative action. A single individual would struggle to approach or process a large animal. But a small group, if it knew how to stand in different positions, wait, and respond at the same time, could greatly increase its chances of success. This required no complex tactics, only simultaneous presence, and the ability to read one another's reactions. Such coordination could not be sustained if individuals did not remain near each other for long periods. And it was precisely hunting shared food and shared fire that strengthened bonds among members of a group. One of the most subtle yet important changes of this period is this: humans began to remain together even when there was no immediate survival need. Before this, groups tended to disperse when food ran out or danger eased. But around 1 million years ago, maintaining a stable group offered long-term benefits, sharing information about the environment, protecting offspring more effectively, keeping fire alive more easily, and most of all, reducing risk for each individual. This was not society in the modern sense. There were no clear roles, no laws. But there was familiarity. Certain individuals appeared together repeatedly. There was recognition of who belonged to the group. By this time, the human brain had grown significantly larger than that of Homo habilis, especially in regions involved in motor coordination and processing social signals. Yet, it was still not developed enough to produce full language. There was no stable vocabulary, no syntax, no capacity for abstraction or for narrating distant past events. Communication, if present, remained limited to the present and to highly specific situations. But living together longer in more stable groups created a new pressure. When humans had to coordinate to exploit animals, protect offspring, keep fire alive, and guard against danger, isolated reflexes were no longer efficient. Acting together required prediction, predicting what others would do next, predicting when to advance, when to retreat, and when to wait. In this context, sound began to carry meaning beyond immediate reflex. A cry was no longer only the expression of fear or pain. It could be produced deliberately to draw others' attention. A short, familiar sound could warn of danger from afar. Another sound could be used to call individuals closer. These sounds did not form language, but they gradually became consistent within a group. Facial expression also began to matter more. When individuals remained close over long periods, small changes in expression, eyes tension in facial muscles, direction of gaze, could transmit information quickly without sound. A wary look could stop a group. A relaxed face could signal that danger had passed. These signals were not explained. They were felt and answered directly. Body posture and movement became part of an emerging system of communication. The way one individual stood, leaned, or began to move could be observed and used by others to adjust their own behavior. The rhythm of action, who went first, who followed, who stopped, slowly created coordination without verbal instruction. What is striking is that these signals did not operate alone. They combined into a multi-channel network of communication in which sound, face posture, and action reinforced one another. A call could be paired with a direction of gaze. A hand motion could accompany a short sound. Meaning did not reside in a single element, but in the consistent repetition of patterns within the same context. Repeated communication within a group, especially over long periods around fire, created a new environment for the brain. As individuals interacted regularly, the brain began to detect patterns in others' behavior. Who reacted quickly? Who hesitated? Who tended to lead? These observations were not necessarily conscious, but they were remembered. The ability to anticipate others' reactions became a survival advantage. An individual could act more effectively if they could predict what those around them would do. This reduced internal conflict, increased coordination, and helped the group respond faster to danger. Over time, individuals better at reading social signals likely had more chances to survive and reproduce. This is the foundation of all later society. Before language, before rules or roles, humans learned the minimum level of mutual understanding, not through words, but through attention repetition and prediction. Society did not begin with ideas or laws. It began when one creature could anticipate another and adjust its behavior accordingly. At this stage, humans did not yet talk to one another, but they were no longer living in silence. In the brief calls, the glances, the synchronized movements, a new communicative space was taking shape, slow, fragile, but solid enough to become the groundwork for language culture and the complex social world that would come much later. With fire-stable tools and longer-lasting social groups, the concept of time also began to shift. It was no longer only now and immediately. Some activities repeated daily. Some places were revisited. There was waiting. This was not long-term planning, but it was an expansion of the present. A day no longer ended completely when the sun went down. An action no longer served only the immediate need, it could also prepare for the coming hours. Yet despite how important these changes were, humans around 1 million years ago still lived within clear limits. Lifespans were short. Mortality was high. There was no collective memory stored beyond direct experience. When a generation disappeared, most knowledge disappeared with it. But within those limits, something new had formed. Humans began to exist as stable groups across time, not merely as temporary gatherings of random individuals. This chapter does not tell of art religion or abstract thought. It tells of humans learning to stay together, to stay around fire, to remain in the same space long enough for habits, memories, and familiarity to form. From this point on, human evolution would no longer happen only in bone and muscle. It would begin to happen in the relationship between human and human, slow, fragile, yet irreversible. The next chapter will bring the story closer to modern humans as the brain continues to develop language, begins to stir, and the inner world of humans grows deeper than ever before. As the previous chapter closed, humans were no longer merely a wandering species relying entirely on individual instinct. They stayed together longer, used more stable tools, maintained fire, and survived in groups durable enough for behaviors to pass across generations. But that very stability opened the door to a new, more complex phase. Humans no longer evolved along a single path. From roughly 400,000 to 300,000 years ago, Earth entered a period in which archaic human populations began to split into multiple lineages, each adapting to very different environments. This was not a deliberate separation. It was the outcome of geography, climate, and distance stretched across thousands of generations. For the first time in the history of this lineage, humans were no longer a relatively uniform group. They became many kinds of humans. Glacial cycles grew deeper and longer. Ice and snow covered large parts of the northern hemisphere for extended stretches, then retreated, leaving behind lands that were cold, damp, and difficult to inhabit. These fluctuations created corridors for migration, and they also created pockets of isolation. In Europe and Western Asia, human populations were trapped in cold environments, thin forests, long winters, and low light. In East Asia, other groups had to adapt to vast terrain, drier climates, and severe swings in conditions. Meanwhile, in Africa, some populations continued to live in diverse environments that were in many regions less extreme, though still shaped by clearly cyclical climate change. This prolonged isolation created the conditions for different human lineages to form, each carrying biological and behavioral traits that reflected the world it had to face. Neanderthals, a product of the cold. In Europe and parts of Western Asia, over hundreds of thousands of years, a distinctive human lineage gradually formed, shaped and hardened by one of the harshest environments humans ever endured. Today, we call them Neanderthals. But the name does not fully capture the reality that they were a direct product of cold, of long winters, and of a world where survival lived close to the edge. Neanderthal bodies carried unmistakable signatures of that environment. They were shorter than modern humans, but powerfully built, broad and deep-chested, with thick bones and strong developed muscles. These proportions were not accidental. In cold climates, a compact, dense body reduces surface area exposed to air and helps conserve heat more efficiently. A wide chest supports large lungs, allowing deep breathing and sufficient oxygen intake during intense physical exertion, like hunting in freezing conditions. Their arms and legs were relatively shorter compared with their torso, an important adaptation that limited heat loss. Their hands were large and strong, with sturdy joints well suited for gripping tools, processing large animal carcasses, and performing tasks that demanded force more than delicacy. Every detail of the Neanderthal body reflected a single priority: staying alive in cold and in a high-risk world. Neanderthal skulls were notably large. In fact, their average brain volume was even larger than that of modern humans. But size alone is not the whole story. The shape and organization of the Neanderthal brain differed from Homo sapiens. Their brains were strongly developed in regions tied to spatial processing, motor coordination, and bodily control abilities, essential for hunting large animals in sparse forests, deep snow, low light, and dangerous terrain. This suggests Neanderthal intelligence was not oriented toward abstraction or symbolism in the modern sense, but toward precision in action. In their world, reading tracks, judging distance, anticipating prey movement, and coordinating the body in dangerous moments mattered more to survival than any form of abstract reflection. For decades, Neanderthals were described as crude, sluggish beings, closer to animals than to humans. But archaeological discoveries in recent times have completely overturned that image. Neanderthals used sophisticated stone tools, especially those associated with the Mousterian tradition, crafted with high precision and suited to many functions, cutting meat, processing hides, working wood, and hunting. They did not hunt only small prey. Evidence shows Neanderthals could confront large and dangerous animals such as bison, ancient elephants, and woolly rhinoceros. Hunts like these could not be carried out by a lone individual. They required group coordination, mutual trust, and the ability to act in sync during extremely risky situations. One of the most persuasive lines of evidence for Neanderthal social life lies in their care for the injured. Fossils show many Neanderthal individuals survived severe injuries, broken bones, missing teeth, damaged joints, injuries that would have made it impossible for them to hunt or survive alone over long periods. Their continued survival makes it clear that others cared for them, shared food, and protected them from danger. This is not compassion in the modern moral sense, but it reflects a high degree of social cohesion where an individual could still matter to the group even when they could no longer contribute directly. In a harsh world, maintaining a stable group sometimes mattered more than immediate efficiency. In addition, there are hints that Neanderthals may have engaged in early symbolic behavior. Some archaeological sites suggest burial of the dead, use of pigments, or retention of objects with no obvious practical value. These behaviors are not enough to prove a fully developed belief system or complete culture, but they show the Neanderthal world was not only raw survival. Still, what must be emphasized is their world remained a world of continuous survival under harsh conditions. Every long winter was a trial. Every hunt carried the possibility of injury or death. Every small mistake, a slip of the foot, a wrong judgment, could cost a life. There was not much room for experimentation, for risky innovation, or for behaviors that did not directly serve existence. Neanderthals did not fail because they were inferior. They endured for a very long time, longer than many other human species. But they were optimized for a particular kind of world. As that world continued to shift, as climate swings grew sharper, and as another lineage with a more flexible strategy appeared, the traits that had once been advantages gradually became limits. Denisovans, the mysterious lineage. To the east of Eurasia, alongside Neanderthals in the west, and archaic human populations in Africa, another human lineage existed, one whose story has been almost erased by time. Today, we call them Denisovans. But that name does not come from a known culture, a vast homeland, or a rich archaeological tradition. It comes from a small cave in Siberia where the first fragile traces of them were found. We know very little about Denisovans, not because they existed in small numbers, but because they left behind very little that could survive. There are few complete skeletons. There is no dense chain of tools strongly associated with their name. Most of what we know about Denisovans comes from genetic traces discovered in the DNA of modern humans tens of thousands of years after Denisovans vanished as a distinct lineage. Yet that very scarcity reveals something important. Human history is not always recorded in stone bone or tools. A large part of it is written in thin strands of genes, readable only when science becomes precise enough to recognize them. And that reminds us that many human stories once existed, but no longer leave enough evidence to be told in full. What we can infer suggests Denisovans adapted to an extremely wide range of environments, from dense mountain forests to cold, high plateaus, where the air is thin and the temperature severe. Their ability to survive at great altitude indicates their bodies and physiology had adapted to low oxygen conditions, a challenge that even modern humans needed thousands of years to adjust to. Denisovans were not a tiny group isolated in a remote corner of the world. Their genetic traces appear in multiple modern human populations across Asia and Oceania, especially in Melanesia and some regions of Southeast Asia. This suggests they once had a broad geographic range and that they encountered, interacted with, and even interbred with other human lineages in different periods. The fact that Denisovans left a mark in the genomes of modern humans shows they did not vanish completely. They were not erased in a single moment. Instead, they gradually dissolved into other lineages, leaving small fragments of themselves inside later generations. Their story did not end in total extinction, but in biological integration. This changes how we understand human evolution. Rather than a simple family tree with branches cleanly cut off, human history looks more like a tangled network, lineages meeting, separating, and crossing again. Denisovans are a clear example of this, a lineage with lasting influence, even while nearly invisible in the traditional archaeological record. We do not know how Denisovans thought. We do not know how they communicated. We do not know whether their inner world included symbols or ritual. But we do know one thing with certainty. They lived long enough, widely enough, and successfully enough to leave their imprint in modern humans themselves. And it is precisely this faint but stubborn presence that makes Denisovans one of the most important chapters in human history. Not because they left abundant artifacts, but because they remind us that what survives does not always reflect everything that once existed. They represent another human possibility adaptation to altitude, to harsh climates, and to environments where other lineages struggled to persist for long. Africa, the cradle of a new capacity. Meanwhile, in Africa, some archaic human populations continued evolving in a different direction. Brain volume continued to increase, but more importantly, the way the brain was used began to shift. Regions linked to communication, social memory, and symbolic processing gradually became more important. Around 300,000 years ago, the first fossils of early Homo sapiens began to appear. They were not yet modern humans as we know them today, but they carried foundational traits, rounder skulls, flatter faces, smaller jaws, and bodies that were more flexible than those of Neanderthals. This did not mean they were immediately smarter, but their bodies allowed a different kind of flexibility, not highly specialized for one environment, but adaptable enough to survive across many contexts. In this period, stone tools entered the Middle Stone Age, the Middle Paleolithic. Tool-making techniques became more refined. Tools were produced for specific functions: cutting, scraping, thrusting, processing hides. This did not reflect artistic creativity. It reflected accumulated experience in solving recurring problems of life. But what mattered even more was how different human groups used tools within social life. In some regions, tools were tightly tied to coordinated hunting. In others, they were tied to processing plants, preparing hides, or preparing food. Each lineage developed its own way of life, reflecting its environment and its history. A key point of this period is that humans began living in a world that contained other humans who were not the same as them. These lineages were not completely separate. There were periods when they met, shared space, and even mixed genetically. This created new challenges. Not only the challenge of facing nature, but the challenge of facing other human groups whose behavior signals and ways of life were slightly different. The ability to observe, learn, and adjust socially became more important than ever. Brains in this era were not only larger, they were operating inside a more complex social space. Humans had to remember more relationships. They had to anticipate the behavior not only of familiar individuals, but of unfamiliar groups. They had to learn to distinguish like us from not like us. This was the groundwork for the formation of group identity, still faint, still unstable. Not culture in the modern sense, but an emerging recognition that not all humans behaved the same way, and that adapting to that difference could bring survival benefits. Not every lineage would continue. Neanderthals and Denisovans eventually disappeared as distinct lineages. Not because they were worse, but because the world kept changing, and traits that were advantageous in one specific environment became less suited as conditions shifted. Homo sapiens with greater behavioral and social flexibility gradually expanded their range. But at this point, they were still only one among many human possibilities, not the inevitable outcome. This chapter is not a story of victory or defeat. It is a story of diversity, of how humans once existed in many forms, many ways of living, and many ways of seeing the world. Human history is not a straight road leading to the present, but a network of possibilities, only some of which continued. From this point onward, the story will focus on a single lineage, Homo sapiens, not because they were chosen, but because they are the ones who remained. And in Chapter 7, we will follow how early modern humans began to carry memory symbolism and a richer inner world than any lineage before them. Around 300,000 years ago in Africa, something new began to appear in the fossil record. It did not arrive like a revolution. It was not accompanied by an explosion of tools or a sudden shift in the way of life. If you do not look closely enough, it is easy to miss. But when the fragments of bone are fitted together, a familiar shape slowly emerges. It is Homo sapiens, not modern humans as we are today, not individuals who already knew how to paint cave walls, tell stories around firelight, or bury their dead with complex ritual. At this point, they had not yet left traces of art, mythology, or symbolism, but they were the first humans to carry the anatomical foundations that would eventually allow all of that to appear, not immediately, but through a long, slow process that was never guaranteed. Homo sapiens did not appear as a brand new species, but as a subtle reorganization of traits accumulated across the millions of years before. When you look at the earliest fossils, what stands out is not a sudden break, but a feeling of familiarity mixed with strangeness, a face that protrudes less forward, a higher forehead expanding the space above the eye sockets, a rounder skull hinting at a more flexible organization of the brain. And yet alongside these older features remain thicker bone structures, not yet fully like those of modern humans. The earliest Homo sapiens fossils have been found across Africa in locations far apart geographically, yet telling a shared story. At Jebel Irhoud in Morocco, fragments of skull show a combination, a modern-looking face paired with brain structure, still bearing ancient traces. At Omokibish and Herto in East Africa, fossils reveal individuals whose overall form is very close to people today, yet still not entirely the same. What matters is this: these discoveries do not show a clean rupture from earlier human species. There is no sharp boundary between before and after. No moment you can point to and say from here onward, humans are modern. Instead, Homo sapiens appears as an extended transitional phase, where newer traits gradually become dominant, while older marks continue alongside them. This reflects how evolution actually works. It does not discard the old the moment the new appears. It experiments at layers, and it retains multiple possibilities at once. Over tens of thousands of years early, Homo sapiens individuals may have looked quite different from one another, some with more modern faces, others with more ancient outlines, yet all belonged to the same forming lineage. This transition also shows that Homo sapiens were not the product of a single biological invention. They were the result of long accumulation, in which each small change in the shape of the skull, the structure of the jaw, the proportions of the body, opened a little more space for new possibilities. Those possibilities were fragile at first. They did not guarantee success, but they created room for brain behavior and social life to develop in directions that were less tightly constrained. At the time of their appearance, Homo sapiens were not yet superior to other human lineages. They were not stronger than Neanderthals. They were not better adapted to cold. They did not possess dramatically better tools. If you judged only by immediate survival advantage, they were not the obvious choice of evolution. But their bodies, lighter, more flexible, less specialized, allowed something crucial: behavior could change faster than biology. And that is the real foundation Homo sapiens carried. Not fully formed intelligence, not culture, but the ability to become different when circumstances demanded difference. The African fossils do not merely mark the appearance of a new species. They mark the moment when human evolution began tilting toward a new direction, where the future would no longer be decided entirely by physical form, but increasingly by how humans learned, remembered, and adapted to a changing world. In this chapter, Homo sapiens had not yet made history, but they carried within their bodies the capacity for history to be made. And it would take hundreds of thousands more years for that capacity to reveal the full extent of its power. A rounder skull, a higher forehead, a flatter face less projected forward, a smaller jaw, tighter, more compact teeth. These changes did not make Homo sapiens stronger or faster. They made the head into a different kind of space, a more flexible space for the brain to develop in new directions. The body of Homo sapiens was different too. They were not as thick-set as Neanderthals, nor were they highly specialized for a single environment. Their limbs were relatively longer, their skeletons were lighter. This made them less cold-tolerant, but more agile in movement, more energy-efficient over long distances, and better able to adapt across varied terrains. Homo sapiens were not the strongest species. They were not the species with the largest brains, but they were the species whose body and brain were least constrained. It is important to emphasize, Homo sapiens did not emerge in a peaceful environment. Africa at this time was a continent undergoing intense fluctuation. Climate swung repeatedly. Wet periods alternated with prolonged droughts. Lakes appeared and disappeared. Vegetation shifted quickly. There was no single standard environment for a body to optimize toward. And that meant any rigid specialization became a risk. In that context, a flexible body, one not perfectly optimized for only one condition, became an advantage. Homo sapiens were not superior in any single skill, but they were good enough in many different skills. And more importantly, they could adjust behavior faster than biology could change. The Homo sapiens brain was not larger than a Neanderthal's, but its organization was different. Regions involved in social processing long-term memory and integrating information from multiple sources began to play a more central role. This does not mean Homo sapiens were smarter from the beginning, but it created a new possibility connecting experience into an inner narrative. An event did not simply happen and disappear. It could be remembered, compared, and linked to other events from the past. The world began to exist, not only outside, but also inside each individual. Homo sapiens still lived in small groups, like earlier human species. But there was a subtle difference. Relationships between individuals began to grow more complex. It was no longer only about who was strong and who was weak. It became about who was trustworthy, who was familiar, who had shared food before, who had helped during hardship. These social memories did not require language to exist. They existed as feeling, as reflex, as prediction. The ability to remember social relationships helped Homo sapiens maintain more stable groups, even as groups gradually grew larger. This reduced internal conflict and increased coordination, an important advantage in a highly unstable environment. In terms of tools, early Homo sapiens were not clearly superior to Neanderthals. They still used Middle Stone Age tools with many similarities, but the way they used tools gradually became more flexible. Instead of binding one tool typed tightly to a single function, early Homo sapiens showed a more adaptable approach to the material world around them. A stone flake was no longer defined by its shape, but by the circumstance in which it was placed. The same piece of stone could cut meat after a hunt scrape bark on another day, or crack bones for marrow when food grew scarce. The value of a tool lay not in perfect specialization, but in rapid adaptation to immediate needs. As a result, manufacturing techniques became more fluid as well. Rather than preserving one fixed template for tens of thousands of years, Homo sapiens groups could change how they struck stone, how they selected raw materials, and how they used tools according to local conditions. Where hard stone was scarce, they learned to make use of smaller pieces. Where resources were more abundant, they allowed themselves to experiment with different methods. These shifts did not have to wait for bodily evolution. They could happen within a single lifetime. This reflects a critical transition in human evolution. Behavior began to change faster than form. For millions of years before adaptation occurred, mainly through the body, longer bones, altered teeth, gradually expanding skulls. But with Homo sapiens, the body was no longer the only place that carried the burden of adaptation. More and more survival pressure was solved by changing methods, changing coordination, and changing the use of what was already available. When behavior became the primary adaptive factor, a new process began to take shape: cultural evolution. Not culture in the sense of art or belief, but the accumulation and transmission of effective ways of doing things. A successful solution could be learned, adjusted, and passed through a group far faster than any biological change. This made Homo sapiens' adaptive speed surpass that of other human lineages, even without a superior body. Alongside flexibility in material behavior, the communication system of Homo sapiens also became richer. At this stage, they still did not have fully formed language, no stable vocabulary, no sentence structure, no ability to recount past events in clear sequence. But communication was no longer just scattered cries. Sounds became more varied in pitch, rhythm, and intensity. A vocalization did not only signal fear or pain, it could carry different shades depending on context. The rhythm of action, how one moved, paused, approached prey, or fire became more synchronized across individuals. This allowed the group to act as a single unit, even without words. Facial expression also became increasingly important. Very small shifts in the eyes, tension in the face, or direction of gaze could transmit information quickly and precisely. A vigilant look could slow the whole group. A relaxed expression could signal the danger had passed. These signals did not require formal teaching. They were absorbed through living close to one another long enough. Most importantly, communication began serving more than immediate action. It began to create emotional bonding. When individuals stayed together more often, especially around a fire in the evening, the presence of others took on a new meaning. Not only as another body to share warmth or keep watch, but as a stable anchor in a world full of uncertainty. The fire became the center of an early social space. Its light extended the usable hours of the day, but it also created a span of relative safety where the body could rest and the brain could allocate resources to activities not entirely bound to survival reflex. In those moments, people began observing one another more closely, remembering one another more deeply, and learning to predict one another's reactions more accurately. A sense of safety, however fragile, is a necessary condition for the brain to expand its capacity to learn and remember. When the body is not constantly locked in high alert, the brain can connect experiences, forming subtler patterns about the world and about other humans. This is the foundation of social memory, trust, and relationships that endure beyond a single situation. At this stage, Homo sapiens were not yet telling stories, but they had begun to share presence. There were no symbols yet, but there were shared emotions. There was no language yet, but there was attunement. And from these fragile beginnings, a new capacity was quietly forming, the capacity to build a world not only with body and tool, but with memory, relationship, and shared experience. It was a silent but decisive transition, bringing Homo sapiens closer to the point where behavior, memory, and culture would become the main drivers of human history. At around 300,000 years ago, Homo sapiens were only one among many human lineages. Neanderthals, Denisovans, and other archaic human populations still lived alongside them. There was no sign that Homo sapiens would become the only remaining line. They had not gone farther. They did not dominate. They had not left a clear mark. If you looked from that moment, the future of Homo sapiens was entirely uncertain. The only thing they possessed was a new capacity to carry an inner world memory relationships and a flexible way of perceiving reality. This chapter does not tell of victory. It tells of potential, of the moment when modern humans appeared biologically while their inner world was still forming. From here on, human history would no longer be decided only by the body, but increasingly by memory symbols and how humans understood themselves. And in Chapter 8, we will step into the moment when Homo sapiens begins to do something never done before preserving memory outside the body through symbols, ritual, and early culture. Things that will permanently change the relationship between humans and time. For millions of years before this, everything humans knew was bound tightly to the body. Lived experience was stored in the brain in reflexes and habits. A behavior existed only as long as there were living people to repeat it. When an individual died, most of the inner world they carried vanished with them. Behavioral evolution did occur, but very slowly, and it was always constrained by living memory. Around 100,000 to 70,000 years ago, that constraint began to shift. At several sites in Africa, archaeologists have found objects that did not directly serve immediate survival. Stones engraved with deliberate, repeated lines that were clearly not random. Lumps of red ochre that had been ground smooth, bearing traces of long-term use. Shells carefully perforated, not for food. These objects did not make humans hunt more effectively. They did not help them run faster, grow stronger, or survive harsh winters more easily. And yet, they were not discarded. They were kept carried and sometimes worked with great care. For the first time, humans were no longer making objects only to answer an immediate need and then be discarded. These objects were meant to stay. They were carried from place to place, kept through seasons, repaired, reused, and protected. An object could now outlive the moment that created it. It could accompany a person across different stages of life. In doing so, it began to gather something that stone tools never needed before: continuity. Until this point, value was almost entirely situational. A sharp edge mattered only while it cut. A shelter mattered only while it blocked wind. When the situation changed, the object lost its purpose. Now value stretched across time. An object could matter not because of what it did right now, but because of what it stood for, what it recalled, signaled, or quietly preserved. This is why pigments, engraved stones, and strings of shells cannot be understood as early attempts at art in the modern sense. They were not created to be admired from a distance. They were not meant to decorate space for its own sake. And they were not narratives frozen into form, waiting to be read with a clear beginning and end. Their power lay elsewhere. They represented what was absent. A piece of red ochre did not only exist as a mineral. Once carried, reused, and recognized, it began to point beyond itself. It could evoke a group, a place visited before a shared practice or a remembered presence. The meaning was not stored in the object alone, nor fully in the mind of one individual. It lived in the space between people, activated when others recognized it. Color, in particular, underwent a transformation. Ground pigment was once just processed matter. But when the same color appeared again and again on bodies, on tools, on objects kept close, it stopped being neutral. It became familiar. And familiarity repeated over time turned into significance. Seeing that color on another person was no longer a purely visual experience. It triggered recognition, not necessarily conscious, not verbalized, but immediate. This person belongs somewhere. This person is connected to something I know. This person shares a history I can feel, even if I cannot explain it. Belonging for the first time was made visible. Engraved patterns worked in a similar way. A set of lines scratched into stone did not strengthen the tool or make it more efficient. But when those same lines appeared again in the same location or across different objects, they marked continuity. They said someone was here before, someone like me, someone who knew this place well enough to leave a trace that was not accidental. These marks turned space into place. A landscape without symbols is anonymous. A landscape with repeated signs becomes familiar. It carries memory not because it is spoken about, but because it has been touched, returned to, and marked in a recognizable way. Over time, these markings quietly reshaped how humans related to their environment. The world was no longer just something they moved through. Parts of it now belonged to shared experience. And then there were the shells. Shells drilled and strung together did nothing to protect the body or increase survival odds. But worn on the body, they transformed the body itself into a carrier of meaning. This was unprecedented. The human body was no longer just biological, it became symbolic terrain. When a person wore such an object, they carried information with them. Before they spoke, before they acted, before they proved anything through behavior. Identity no longer had to be demonstrated moment by moment. It could be displayed quietly and persistently. This changed social life in a fundamental way. Recognition no longer relied solely on memory of past interactions. It could be triggered instantly visually through shared symbols. Trust, familiarity, and distinction began to operate at a distance before words or actions intervened. In this way, meaning detached itself from the present moment. Objects could now recall the past. They could signal affiliation. They could preserve emotional weight. They could survive the death of the person who first gave them significance and still be recognized by others. This was not art. It was not religion. It was not culture, as we usually define it. But it was the condition that made all of those things possible. For the first time, humans began living in a world where meaning was not limited to what was happening now, but could be carried forward quietly, materially, and collectively through time. Engraved patterns on stone functioned the same way. They did not make the stone harder, sharper, or more useful. But when the same kinds of markings appeared in the same place across generations, the pattern became a sign. It marked that this place had been returned to, that it held memory, that it was no longer anonymous nature. And especially at this stage, humans began to do something unprecedented. They began making personal ornaments. Strings of perforated shells, small pieces of bone ground, smooth objects with no direct survival value were worn on the body. This was an extraordinarily important transition. For the first time, the human body became a surface that carried meaning. An ornament did not help someone run faster, hunt better, or fight more effectively, but it communicated something to others. That the wearer belonged to a particular group, that they were connected to a place, a custom, or a shared history, that they were not merely a biological individual, but a person with a position within a social network. Crucially, these ornaments did not need to be explained. They required no words, no formal teaching. Their meaning formed through repetition and familiarity. When a group of people used similar objects over a long enough time, meaning became natural felt rather than spoken. This was the first moment in history when humans began carrying their identity outside themselves. Before this, all information about an individual existed only in immediate behavior, what they were doing, where they were, how they reacted. Now, some of that information was attached to the body itself, remaining visible even when the individual was silent or still. Ornaments were not about aesthetics. They were about social memory. A string of shells could be linked to an event, a relationship, or a phase of life. When worn again, memory was recalled. When seen by others, that memory could be shared even without a spoken narrative. For this reason, these early ornaments marked a profound shift. Humans began living in a world where meaning was no longer bound to immediate action, but could be carried, preserved, and recognized across time. At this stage, Homo sapiens had not yet created art, had not built complex rituals, had not told long stories. But they had done something foundational to all of those things. They began turning material into memory, and turning the human body into a place where memory could appear in the world. This was the moment when humans ceased to exist solely within the present of survival and took their first steps into a symbolic life, fragile, rudimentary, but irreversible. Symbols allowed humans to compress experience into material form. An emotion, a relationship, or a memory no longer had to exist only in the mind. It could be attached to an object, and that object could be seen, touched, and remembered again. This was the great turning point of the period. Once humans began leaving intentional traces in the material world, memory was no longer limited to living bodies. An engraved stone could outlast its maker. A preserved object could be seen and reused by later generations. Time for the first time became visible. Before this, the past existed only in the memories of the living. When they died, that past vanished with them. Now the past could remain as traces, not as narrated history, but as the silent presence of what had once been. A place with repeated patterns showed that humans had returned there many times. A worn object showed it had been kept and used over long periods. The world itself began to accumulate memory, not only within people, but within the spaces they inhabited. There was no single cause, no moment of enlightenment. These changes likely emerged from the convergence of several long-term factors. First was the scale and structure of society. Homo sapiens now lived within more complex social networks. Groups were not completely isolated. They met separated and met again seasonally. Within such networks, recognizing who was familiar, who was other, and who belonged to which group became increasingly important. Symbols solved this problem. A worn object, a familiar mark, or a color could transmit social information faster than any behavior. Second was relative stability of survival. In some regions, Homo sapiens achieved enough security that they no longer had to react constantly to immediate danger. When basic survival needs were met more consistently, the brain gained room to engage in activities not strictly necessary for moment-to-moment survival. Third was cognitive capacity, reaching a threshold. The Homo sapiens brain did not suddenly change, but it had accumulated enough flexibility to link images, emotions, and memories in new ways. When an object could evoke an experience, and that experience could be shared within a group, symbolism became possible. At this stage, there is no clear evidence of organized religion or fully developed belief systems. But one thing had unmistakably appeared: deliberate repetition. The same kinds of engraved patterns appearing at the same locations across multiple sediment layers are not coincidence. Each layer represents a different time period, sometimes separated by thousands of years. The repetition of the same markings, the same compositional logic, shows that humans returned to the same spaces not only to shelter or forage, but to continue a familiar action. The use of ochre tells a similar story. Pigments were not found once and then abandoned. They appear repeatedly with wear marks indicating long-term use across generations. This implies that knowledge of how to collect, prepare, and use ochre was not interrupted. It was preserved, observed, and relearned, not through explanation, but through sustained presence. The repeated placement of drilled holes in shells is even more striking. Drill in the wrong spot, and the shell breaks. Drill in the right spot, and it can be strung and carried. When the same drilling points appear again and again across different specimens, it shows that humans remembered a specific method and passed it on through observation and practice. This was not random experimentation, but the maintenance of a stable behavioral pattern. All of this shows that humans were not simply acting out of momentary curiosity and then moving on. They returned to the same places, repeated the same behaviors, and preserved them long enough for those behaviors to become the familiar way. This familiarity was not written down, not formally taught, but lived within the rhythm of the group, in what was seen every day, in what was done repeatedly without question. This is the clearest sign of deliberate repetition, not biological instinct, because instinct does not produce such flexible patterns. Not yet fully developed cultural tradition, but something in between, a form of early collective memory, where behavior was preserved, not because it was immediately necessary for survival, but because it had become part of how that group existed in the world. When a behavior can outlive a single human lifespan, when it continues, even after the first people to perform it are gone, something new has entered human history. Not merely survival across time, but the survival of behavior itself. And from these quiet repetitions, humans began building a world with temporal depth, a world in which the past does not disappear completely, but leaves traces clear enough for the next generation to step into. This repetition was not biological reflex, it was early collective memory. A group began sharing not only space and food, but also ways of doing things that felt right, familiar, or ours. As symbols appeared, the inner world of humans changed as well. Objects were no longer only seen, but understood on another level. A color could evoke emotion. A pattern could recall memory. A preserved object could carry an unspoken story. This allowed emotions to be anchored in the material world. An experience no longer passed and vanished. It could be recalled through symbolic objects. And when many people shared that understanding, emotion became collective experience extending beyond the individual. Humans began living in a two-layered world, the physical layer of stone, fire, and food, and the mental layer of meaning, memory, and relationship. These changes did not occur evenly. Some groups developed symbolism earlier. Others left almost no trace. Cultural evolution was not a smooth stream, but a series of surges and pauses. A symbolic practice could emerge and then vanish when the environment grew harsher. A group could dissolve before passing its behavior on. For this reason, the history of this period is a history of fragile experiments, not guaranteed progress. This chapter does not tell of great art or radiant civilizations. It tells of the moment when humans began leaving mental traces in the material world, when memory was no longer confined to the brain, when meaning could be carried, when the past could exist independently of those who had lived it. From this point onward, human history would accelerate in a new way, not because bodies changed faster, but because ideas, memories, and symbols could outlive the people who created them. No day was ever recorded. No sign appeared in the sky. There was no thunder, and there was no solemn proclamation. The withdrawal of the gods did not happen as an event that could be told, but as a quiet habit that simply vanished. One morning, humans woke up and realized that something had changed, yet no one could point to the exact moment it began. The tall shadows that used to stand at the edge of the camp no longer appeared. The deep, even voices echoing like stones rolling in a cave were no longer heard. The hands that once showed them how to measure land, how to read the stars, how to listen to the breathing of the earth no longer rested upon human shoulders. No one said the gods had left. It was simply that they were no longer there. And the most frightening thing was not that humans had been abandoned, but that they were no longer certain whether they had ever been guided at all. At first, the change was almost impossible to detect. Familiar faces still lived in memory. Names were still whispered in old rituals, though no one clearly remembered why they had to be whispered or why those rites had once mattered. Stories were still told around the fire, but with each retelling they lost a small detail, one connection, one missing segment, one meaning that had once been seamless. People still sowed by the seasons, still hunted along familiar traces, still gave birth, still buried their dead as before. Life did not collapse. It continued. But there was one difference so small, so subtle, that no one could measure it, no one could name it, no one stood between them and the sky anymore. Before, the sky was not merely space overhead. It was a structure with order, with layers, with laws that had explanations. Every movement carried meaning. Every phenomenon came with an interpretation. Thunder was not only thunder, stars were not only stars. Wind was not only wind. Now the sky became silent. Not an empty silence, but a heavy one, forcing the human mind to fill it with guesses, with fear, with imagination not yet under control. When explanations no longer came from outside, humans began to turn inward. And inside was not clarity, but a deep hollow, where memory, instinct, and anxiety blended together. At first, sleep was still only rest, a necessary pause after a long, exhausting day. But very quickly, it became the only space that still held a faint connection to what had been lost. When awake, humans were too busy surviving, finding food, shielding themselves from the cold wind, protecting themselves from beasts, and hunger keeping the fragile existence of the next day intact. When they slept, they could no longer control their consciousness. The boundaries built while awake collapsed. And it was precisely in that loosened space that old images began to return. They did not come as personal memories. There was no beginning, no ending, no clear sequence. They came as floating fragments colliding in the darkness of the mind. Some dreamed of tall beings deep beneath the ground, unmoving, only murmuring like mountains, breathing like ancient stone, still holding the memory of pressure. Some dreamed of the sky cracking like an eggshell, light pouring down for an instant, and then vanishing, leaving the feeling that something had opened, yet not for them. Some dreamed of water, not rain, not a river, but water rising from every direction with no source, no path, no reason. Those dreams were not named. No one stood up and said, "This is an omen." No one tried to explain or systematize them. People of that time did not yet have language for such things. They only kept what remained upon waking a feeling strangely familiar, as if they had once known it, once witnessed it, once lived inside those images, long before they possessed memory of themselves. Some woke with hearts pounding, not knowing whether from fear or from longing. Some woke in silence, carrying an uneasy emptiness, as if they had just lost something important, but could not determine what. Gradually, sleep was no longer only rest. It became the place where humans touched deeper layers of themselves. Things that could not be spoken while awake began to appear in dreams. Questions with no answers found their way back as images. And while by day humans learned to forget in order to keep living by night, ancient memory quietly rose up, reminding them that there had been a time when the world was different, order was different, and humans had not stood alone beneath such a silent sky. Not all gods left in the same way. Some no longer walked upon the earth, yet they also did not return to the sky. They remained in the in-between. They did not intervene, did not guide, did not punish. They only watched. Later traditions called them by many names, but in the deepest layer of this story, they were felt only as the watchers of sleep. They did not appear when humans were awake. They did not take form in the light. They were present only when consciousness loosened, when the mind no longer clung to shape, to names, to boundaries. They watched dreams not to correct them, but to remember how much humans still retained of what had once been given. Before, the memory of the world lived in structure. It was held by weight, by order, by the stubborn repetition of matter. In blocks of stone set in the right place where the smallest deviation could collapse the entire form. In tablets carved with signs where memory was fixed into lines that did not permit forgetting. In the way a city was aligned to stars and water, where space itself became a vast record, forcing humans to live according to a rhythm already set in advance. Back then, memory did not need to be remembered. It was present, it surrounded, it pressed humans into obedience. But the world did not remain still long enough for stone to continue doing that work. The movement of land, of water, of climate, and of humans themselves began to accelerate beyond what matter could hold. The structures that once carried memory were eroded, collapsed, or lost their original meaning. The carvings still remained, but the readers were gone. The stellar alignments were still overhead, but no one stood in the right place to understand what they once pointed to. Memory did not vanish in a moment. It slipped away slowly from the things that had once kept it safe. And when memory could no longer be stable enough to carve into matter, it sought another place to live. Not a more durable place, but a more flexible one. It moved into the human body, a place fragile, easily wounded, yet able to adapt. Memory no longer existed as clear information, but as sensation. No longer as something taught, but as something reflexive. It lived in the way humans avoided a nameless darkness, in the unease when a sound rang out off-beat, in fear that arrived without attaching itself to any specific threat. That memory did not speak in words. It offered no reasons. It only whispered that there were boundaries not to be crossed, though no one remembered when those boundaries had been built. That there were actions that felt wrong, though there was no law explaining why. That there were places that made humans hesitate not because of visible danger, but because the body reacted before consciousness could intervene. That was not pure biological instinct. That was memory compressed, broken, yet never erased. The watchers of sleep did not carve memory back into stone. They did not teach it through language. They understood the world had entered a different phase where memory could not exist as before. Their role was not to create something new, but to keep the old from dissolving completely. They allowed memory to live in distorted form, unfinished, sometimes uncomfortable, sometimes frightening, yet still strong enough to influence human behavior. Strong enough to make humans hesitate. Strong enough to prevent certain mistakes from repeating, even though no one remembered what the first mistake had been. And from that moment, History was no longer written only in stone and carved signs. It began to be written in the body through restless sleep, through reflexes that could not be explained, through fears passed from one generation to the next without any story attached. The memory of the world no longer stood outside the human being. It lived inside, quietly smoldering, waiting to be awakened, not by words, but by events. Not everyone dreamed the same. Not everyone remembered. And over time, a difference began to emerge, subtle at first, almost imperceptible, yet impossible to reverse once it had taken hold. Some people dreamed more often. Their nights were crowded with images, sensations, fragments that did not dissolve upon waking. They spoke of these dreams by the fire, not as prophecies, not as explanations, but as things that needed to be spoken aloud, lest they weigh too heavily inside. They repeated gestures whose origins no one could trace. They kept rites whose meanings had thinned, blurred, or vanished entirely, yet still felt necessary. These actions no longer served an obvious practical purpose. They did not help build shelters faster or gather food more efficiently, and yet no one dared discard them. Not because of fear of punishment, but because abandoning them felt like cutting away something that still held the group together in ways no one fully understood. These people became almost without intention the keepers of story. Not storytellers in the later sense of entertainment or instruction, but custodians of continuity. They held rhythm of nights and days, of seasons, of gestures, repeated at the same moment each year. They preserved the act of remembering itself, even when what was remembered could no longer be clearly named. Their value did not lie in usefulness as measured by survival alone, but in maintaining a thread that ran backward into a past no one could see directly anymore. Others changed in a different direction. They dreamed less, or at least remembered less of what they dreamed. Their nights were quieter, their days sharper. They learned to focus on what could be measured, handled, controlled. They built, they expanded, they refined tools and techniques. They trusted what the hands could touch and the eyes could verify. For them, the world consisted increasingly of surfaces, structures, and outcomes. Fear became something to manage or eliminate, not something to sit with. Memory became a burden rather than a guide. This divergence was not moral. It was not a split between good and evil, wisdom and ignorance. It was a division between remembering and forgetting. Between those who carried echoes of older layers of experience and those who learned, perhaps out of necessity, to let those echoes fade in order to move forward more efficiently. Both paths allowed survival. Both paths shaped the world, but they did not always understand each other. And from that quiet fracture, many later conflicts would arise, between those who insisted that something unseen still mattered, and those who believed that only what could be proven should guide action, between those who preserved ritual without explanation, and those who demanded explanation before preservation. These tensions would resurface again and again across history, wearing different names, adopting different symbols, but always returning to the same underlying divide. No one predicted the Great Flood. There was no calendar counting down to it, no announcement, no warning spoken aloud. And yet many people dreamed of it, not as a coherent story with sequence and cause, but as a sensation, an unshakable certainty that something was rising. The dreams did not show walls collapsing or waters breaking through gates. They showed pressure, weight, encroachment, a feeling of being surrounded by something that had no clear edge. Water appeared in sleep before it appeared in life. It came without explanation, without origin. It seeped into dreams as an atmosphere, rather than an event. And because there were no words yet to bind these dreams into shared meaning, they remained private until they didn't. Until the same images, the same sensations began to surface across different minds, across different fires, across different nights. The Watchers of Sleep did not intervene. They did not stop what was coming, and they did not summon it. Their role was neither salvation nor destruction. They observed. They registered the moment when memory long fragmented and buried in bodies began to align again. When dreams grew similar, when fear ceased to belong to individuals and became collective. When what had been carried silently inside many people began to resonate as one. That was the moment when the earth began to speak in a single voice, not through words, but through convergence, through repetition, through the collapse of private experience into shared certainty. The dreams did not explain what would happen. They only announced that something no longer belonged to the realm of possibility. It was approaching inevitability. And in that convergence before any water rose in the waking world, the deepest function of memory was fulfilled. Not to prevent the event, not to save, but to prepare the human mind, however imperfectly, for a reality it could not yet face with open eyes. In the last nights before the event, there were fires that burned for a very long time. Not because it was cold, but because no one wanted to sleep. No one spoke the reason aloud, yet everyone felt that sleeping now meant returning to the place where memory was becoming too clear. The Watchers of Sleep were there, not looking, with eyes not standing anywhere specific, only present as a faint pressure in the air, like the feeling of being watched without being judged. And when humans finally slept, not all of them dreamed of water. Some dreamed of the sky tearing open. Some dreamed of enormous beings turning away and descending into the earth. Some dreamed of nothing at all, an absolute silence. The Great Flood did not arrive suddenly. It came after a long time of memory being compressed, after the gods no longer stood between humans, and consequence after sleep became the only place where the earth could speak to itself. The Watchers of Sleep did not save humanity, and they did not destroy it. They only witnessed the moment when memory was no longer enough to prevent the inevitable. And when the waters began to rise in waking life, the dreams fell silent as if the task had been completed. Around 12,000 years ago, humans stood before a threshold of choice whose full consequences none of them could have understood. There was no council, no collective decision, no moment remembered as the beginning of civilization. There were only very small actions repeated long enough to become habit. They stayed. They stayed longer beside familiar rivers. They stayed through multiple seasons in the same valley. They stayed to wait for plants to grow back. They stayed to protect food sources that could be predicted. And from those acts of staying repeated again and again, a new way of life slowly took shape. The human shift toward farming and animal domestication, commonly called the Neolithic Revolution, did not unfold as a leap toward comfort or happiness. From the perspective of individual experience, much evidence suggests that life became harder for a long time. Diets grew monotonous, dependent on only a few crops. Teeth and bones bear signs of nutritional deficiency. Infectious diseases increased as people lived closer together in denser communities. Labor became heavy and repetitive, dictated by seasonal cycles wearing down the body. Average life expectancy did not rise immediately. In some regions, it even declined compared to hunting and gathering societies. But farming brought something fundamentally different, and in the long term, decisive predictability. Food no longer depended entirely on the luck of the hunt or the daily unpredictability of nature. It became tied to land, to seasonal cycles, and to labor invested in advance. Sowing seeds was a wager on the future. Waiting became a new form of discipline. When humans planted and waited, they were forced to stay to guard, tend, and observe rather than leave when conditions turned unfavorable. This predictability reshaped the rhythm of life. Humans no longer counted only days. They began to count seasons. They no longer thought only about the next meal, but about the next harvest. Work done today was understood as serving months to come. From this emerged annual schedules of lifetimes for planting, harvesting, storing, and resting. Time became a long, structured sequence rather than a chain of disconnected moments. The relative stability of food supplies also changed how humans organized society. When food could be stored, decisions had to be made about who would keep it, where it would be kept, and how it would be distributed. When land could be cultivated, boundaries and access had to be defined. These questions did not exist in mobile lifestyles. Farming thus became not merely a production technique, but a new social framework, one in which long-term time horizons, responsibility, and obligation gradually became central. Importantly, this trade-off did not occur once and then stabilize. For many generations, humans lived between two rhythms, carrying memories of mobile life while struggling to adapt to staying put. In some places, people returned to hunting when harvests failed. In others, they moved deeper into cultivation. There was no single path. But when predictability proved effective on a large scale, supporting more people on the same land, it gradually prevailed. Ultimately, what farming provided was not immediate happiness, but the ability to plan for a distant future. And that ability, despite its fatigue and risk, opened the way to villages, cities, laws, and recorded history. Humans accepted the costs of the present in exchange for a future they could imagine. From that moment on, the world began to operate according to rhythms set by humans themselves. That predictability came with binding constraints. To stay with fields meant one could no longer leave easily. To protect crops meant defending territory. And when many people stayed in the same place, conflict became unavoidable. When humans stayed, land ceased to be neutral space. It became place. A plot cultivated over many years, accumulated labor memory and claims. From this emerged the concept of ownership, not first through law, but through habit and mutual defense. Houses appeared not as sudden inventions, but as natural consequences of staying one more season than another. At first, they were simple structures, wine-shielding pits, wooden frames covered with grass, sun-dried mud walls. They were not built to last forever, but they were durable enough to return to when seasons repeated. And it was the act of returning that mattered most. Each time people returned, they did not start from nothing. Old hearth ash remained marking where fire once burned. Bone seed husks and broken tools lay in old refuse pits. The ground once trodden became more compact. Space began to carry human traces in concrete ways, not through conscious preservation, but through the repetition of daily life. Gradually, these traces layered over one another. A new fire was lit atop old ash. A new floor leveled over one used before. A new refuse pit dug beside an older one. No one intended to create a village. But as multiple families stayed, returned, repaired, and added villages formed as an inevitable outcome. Here, land began to carry memory in a deeply material sense. Not memory stored in minds, but memory compressed into lived space. Each soil layer reflected a different phase of life, a year of abundance, a year of hunger, a year of population growth, a year when a family disappeared. These changes did not need to be spoken to persist. They were preserved in the very structure of habitation. When one generation was born and raised atop the foundations of another, the relationship to time changed profoundly. The past was no longer distant, existing only in stories. It lay beneath one's feet. It appeared in repaired walls, familiar paths, places where someone once lived. Humans inhabited spaces that already had history, even before history was written. This layering meant time no longer flowed straight. It settled. It accumulated. What had happened did not vanish completely. It became the foundation for what followed. Every new action inadvertently entered into dialogue with older ones, continuing modifying or erasing them. From that moment, humans no longer lived only in the present, but among overlapping layers of time. And when living space became a vessel of memory, human society entered a new state. It was no longer easy to leave without leaving something behind. Staying was no longer merely a survival choice. It became an invisible commitment to the past and to those yet to come. Farming allowed more people to be sustained on the same land, and the consequences appeared faster than any previous social change. Within only a few generations, community size expanded. Children survived at higher rates due to seasonal food stability, despite monotonous and nutritionally limited diets. Groups once accustomed to dozens of individuals where everyone knew one another grew into communities of hundreds or more. This growth altered the experience of society itself. Humans began living within stable crowds rather than small mobile bands. But this growth was not a free reward. It brought increasing structural pressure over time. Each additional mouth required not only food today, but food for the year ahead, for dry seasons, for failed harvests. Population growth did not scale linearly with effort. It scaled with obligation. The larger the community, the greater the need for stability, and the greater its vulnerability to disruption. More mouths required more production. But greater production did not arise naturally. It demanded more labor, clearing new land, removing trees, improving soil, planting at the right moment, harvesting on time, drying, storing, and protecting crops from moisture pests or theft. Labor ceased to be short, concentrated bursts like hunting and became a year-round sequence tightly bound to seasonal calendars. This transformation affected both body and mind. Repetitive heavy labor wore down health. Spines, knees, teeth, and bones bear signs of overwork and nutritional imbalance. More importantly, time lost flexibility. People could no longer leave easily when conditions worsened because fields bound them to stay and defend invested labor. When harvests failed due to drought, flooding, pests, or climate shifts, the consequences extended beyond temporary hunger. In dense communities, failure became systemic crisis. Stored reserves depleted faster than expected. Tensions rose. Decisions about distribution became matters of survival. Who eats first? Who waits? Who goes hungry? These questions did not exist in small hunting bands, but became unavoidable in farming societies. To offset risk, humans responded by expanding cultivation, clearing more land, working harder, storing more. Yet each safety step increased future obligations. Expansion required more labor. More labor encouraged maintaining high populations. High populations demanded even greater production. Thus emerged a tightening loop. The more people, the more production required. The more production, the more people needed to sustain it. This loop had no natural stopping point. It did not collapse immediately, nor did it produce comfortable equilibrium. Instead, it generated a society perpetually compelled to continue to keep planting, storing, expanding, because stopping meant risking collapse. Humans were not coerced by external forces, but by the survival structures they themselves created. From this point on, human history entered a new trajectory. No longer the story of groups moving through the world, but of communities bound to their own growth. Farming did not merely feed more people. It produced a social momentum that forced humans to do more each day to keep tomorrow from falling apart. That momentum continues to shape societies, conflicts, and choices thousands of years later. Within this loop, society began to stratify not because someone deliberately sought power, but because different roles became necessary. Not everyone could do everything at once. Some specialized in cultivation because they understood land and seasons. Some herded animals across pastures. Some guarded stores critical to communal survival. Some stored distributed and remembered quantities and timing. Some organized rituals to maintain cohesion and order in growing communities. Division of labor increased efficiency. Repeated over time, each role became more skilled. But it also created unequal access to fertile land, food stores, information, and decision-making. These differences were not necessarily unjust at first. They arose from operational needs. But sustained over generations, they became fixed. From here, inequality emerged, not as a sudden event, but as a systemic property. Those who controlled food stores held greater influence during scarcity. Those who managed ritual defined sacred and profane. Those who protected order wielded organized violence. These powers initially served communities, but gradually detached from original purposes. Notably, this stratification unfolded silently. There was no first constitution, no official proclamation. It was reinforced through habit, repeated roles, and collective memory of how things are done. When children grew up in worlds already structured by roles, boundaries, and expectations, inequality no longer needed enforcement. It was inherited. Thus, farming reshaped society in depth labor rhythms, population scale power, and inequality. This was not a random deviation of history, but the logical outcome of storing and growing a path that opened civilization while sowing tensions that human societies still confront today. When food could be stored, power emerged around controlling stores. When land could be owned, disputes arose around boundaries. When populations grew dense, rules, however crude, became necessary to limit conflict. The early symbols of chapters 8 and 9 now had ground in which to root. Rituals arose to bind dense communities. Myths formed to explain the world and legitimize social order. Language developed to manage, recount, and teach. Humans did not merely make objects. They recorded first with symbols, then with writing. When writing appeared, memory no longer depended on living minds or isolated symbolic objects. It became systematically preserved. History emerged not from curiosity about the past, but because complex societies needed to remember themselves. Time now possessed not only past and future, but chronology. Cities emerged as nodes of people, goods, and power. States formed to manage populations, taxation, labor, and war. These structures enabled projects beyond the capacity of small groups, canals, levees, monumental works, but the costs rose. Warfare became organized. Disease spread rapidly in dense spaces. Individuals were bound by laws and obligations. Humans were no longer fully free to leave when conditions worsened. Progress and loss traveled together. No historical period offered pure gain. In the last few thousand years, science and technology accelerated everything. Fossil fuels expanded production scale. Machines replaced muscular labor. Information spread instantly. The world shrank in distance, but grew more complex in consequence. Humans gained the power to shape the planet to alter climate-drive extinctions, restructure ecosystems. That power did not come with proportional collective wisdom. Small decisions could produce global effects. Despite cities and advanced technology, modern humans still carry bodies and minds shaped hundreds of thousands of years ago. Our brains still respond strongly to fear, immediate reward, and group belonging. Many tensions of modern society arise from the mismatch between worlds we create and the biology we carry. This is not a failure of evolution. It is the consequence of speed. Looking back from the first upright individuals to the modern world, no single moment explains everything. There was no magic leap, only small changes accumulated over time, standing to see farther, using hands to carry, staying to wait for seasons, storing memory outside the body, telling stories to bind groups, writing to remember longer. We are Homo sapiens, the species that stays with its memory. And that is both our strength and our burden. The 5 million year journey does not end in the present. It continues in small decisions, what we stay with, what we let go of, and how we choose to shape the future. Because in the end, human history is not a story of victory, but of choices repeated long enough to become the world. You've just traveled through 5 million years in a very short time. But this story does not belong only to the past. It continues right now, where you are sitting in your breathing, in the way you eat, work, rest, and choose to remain in the world around you. If you are listening at night, perhaps in a quiet room, perhaps as the city outside has begun to slow down, take a moment to think about this. In a world that constantly pushes us to move faster, go farther, and want more, what are you choosing to stay with? I would really like to know. Where are you listening from? What time is it where you are right now? You can leave a comment, just one line about where you are, or a short thought that stayed with you after this story. I read every one of those messages. And it is through these small traces that this journey continues from one person to another. If you'd like to keep taking these slow journeys through history, evolution, and stories longer than a single lifetime stay with the channel, subscribe and let the next stories find you when the world outside has grown quieter. Have a peaceful night, and thank you for staying until the very end of this journey.